Good morning. Today is Friday, May the 17th, 2019. The time is just about 2 minutes after 10 o'clock, and this is the meeting of the Texas Appraiser Licensing Board. The first item on our agenda is our call to order and pledges of allegiance. I've asked Mr. Sostre to lead us in those, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. The next item on our agenda is roll call and possible action to excuse board members' absences, if any.
Chair Damon Goodcliff.
Present.
Martha Gill Reed Lynch. Chance Bolton.
Present.
Clayton Black.
Present.
Jim Jeffries.
Present.
Tony Bennett.
Present.
Lester Renfro. Alex Sostre.
Present.
And Joyce Unuki.
Present.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Bolton.
move that the absences of Martha Gale Reed Lynch and Buster Renfro for the May 17, 2019 board meeting are hereby excused.
Second.
A motion by Mr. Bolton and a second by Mr. Pena. Both of those board members have been in contact with the organization and myself, and they both have justification for being gone. So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Next item on our agenda is the opportunity for public comment for items regarding non-agenda issues. So we welcome public comment. If you wish to address the board on something that's not currently identified on today's agenda, please come forward.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Garoon. Can you state your name for the record?
Glenn Garoon. I'm an appraiser from Fort Worth. Haven't been here in a while, which is good for you. And the drive down Waco's become a real traffic.
Fun place to come through from
At
your...
any rate. I'm also signed up to speak on agenda item 13, which is the education forms. But, and I had intended on coming down for that, and then last night I received an email regarding the RFQ for, and maybe I'm confused, I thought it was for all review services. As a PIC member for the past 4 or 5 years, I guess, I'm used to signing a form every couple years that says I'll be good and won't, and won't violate confidentiality and everything else. So I was a little bit surprised last night to receive a 16-page contract, based on the RFQ. And I will tell you, if you think I'm going to sign that without getting a lawyer to review it, I mean, I know the commissioner's an attorney. I know there's a general counsel. Troy is sitting back here. I mean, y'all, there are lawyers in this room. How many of you would suggest that any of us who received that agreement would sign that without getting our own attorney to review it? Are you suggesting that?
I'm suggesting that it was provided in the RFQ solicitation,
Yes.
the same documentation, so there was plenty of opportunity at least to review it. You certainly are welcome to have an attorney review it again before signing.
So I guess the question is if I do, and I thought about that on the way down, that it was probably in the packet of materials, except out of sight, out of mind until you actually get accepted. So I guess the question is that unchangeable? Or if I have an attorney, I'll do my cousin Vinny routine on you, okay? My sister's an attorney, my daughter's an attorney. My father was an attorney and a judge. He's no longer with us. I did attend law school briefly, but it was not a good fit. And so that's my cousin Vinny routine. So I don't like to sign things that are that long. And so I guess the question is, if I come up with a change, is that something that's a deal killer, or does that trigger a Supreme Court review? So at any rate, that seems a bit, and I guess the other question is, does that include PIC and audits? Does that include everything?
So for clarity, I did want to jump in and please either staff, maybe it would be better if staff answered it, but I understand the RFQ to simply be for the experience audits that we have asked to be removed from our staff because they've been overwhelmed, and create an opportunity out in the industry to have people do RFQs. It has nothing to do, and you're not creating new obligations as it relates to your PIC work that you've so graciously done for us, is my understanding. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Doesn't say that. It says review work.
No, you're absolutely right, but it is specific to the RFQ, and the RFQ is circled. It has circled the kind of work that is going to be done, and under that particular scope, is really just meant to address the audits of certified general upgrading applicants. That's all.
All right, thanks.
So, you know that we can't take official action as a board on something that's not currently on our agenda, but I would tell you that if you want to write not for PIC work on yours, I bet you they can, I bet you somebody will look at it. Does not apply to my PIC work.
Well, like I say, the PIC work I do, with all due respect to the staff who constantly ask me for my bank information, and I haven't submitted one of those $75 invoices yet because it takes me longer to fill out the paperwork, and I can be doing real work. So, that's pro bono. I don't mind doing that. But so I wanted to clarify those. And I couldn't help but gig a couple people about 16-page contracts.
Well, and we don't want to lose your charitable contribution to the organization, so that's why I want you to feel confident to continue that work.
Well, as long as you're good to me, that's probably good.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Green. Is there anyone else that would like to make public comment on items that are not currently on our agenda? Seeing none, we will move to agenda item number 4, which is the ratification of the official record for February the 7th and 8th. So that's our workshop and our regular board meetings. Are there any corrections or questions?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Bolton?
move the ratification of the official record of the February 7, 2019 and February 8, 2019 board meetings as approved for posting on the website by the Secretary of the Board.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Bolton, second by Mr. Black. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes unanimously. I am going to make a slight order change on the agenda. I'm going to move agenda item number 6 ahead of the enforcement matters because I've had a question asked that I believe would be appropriate for executive session from a board member. So, executive session to discuss pending litigation or receive advice of counsel pursuant to Texas Government Code 551.071 and personnel matters pursuant to Texas Government Code. The time is about 12 minutes after 10 o'clock, and we will now go into executive session to obtain that advice of legal counsel and discuss pending or contemplated litigation, including settlement offers and enforcement actions pursuant to the code previously mentioned, and personnel matters pursuant to the Texas Government Code 551.074. We anticipate returning to open session, I would say, in about 40 minutes, and Doug or Kristen, is the assembly upstairs or down? Board will assemble upstairs. Guesser at how much time it might take. So next time we'll try and estimate a little less conservative. The time is now 11:30, and we are reassembled back into open public session. We are missing one board member for the record. I'm sure he will be here shortly. Of course.
Madam Chair, should we identify a missing member of the board, for the record, of course?
I was trying to spare him that, which is why I hadn't moved forward. Had we moved forward taking action, I would have definitely identified him. We are now fully assembled, and now the time is 11:32, and the board is back from executive session, reconvening an open session. There's no action to be taken from executive session. We are moving to agenda item number 5, which is the final orders and surrenders in the matters listed.
Madam Chair and board members, Kristen Warman, your general counsel, and this item is before you. I just wanted to recall for the public record that the board at its meeting in February adopted a change in procedure whereby the board delegated authority to the chair to sign all final orders for the board. And we have presented the final orders that have been signed by the chair since the February board meeting. Those are all included in your materials. And if you have any questions, you are certainly welcome to ask those of staff. But there is no action needed, as the board has already taken that action by its delegation of authority.
Are there any questions related to agenda item number 5? I will only make one public comment, that when I agreed to take on the responsibility, I didn't realize those agreed orders were going to chase me around the world, and they do. But good job, staff, in terms of getting those together.
Thank you.
We'll move to agenda item number 7, the report by the Budget Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we've been at it pretty hard since the last meeting. We've held, since the February quarterly board meeting, the Budget Committee has met twice. First time on April 8th at 1:30, and then again on April 24th at 2 o'clock. Both were via teleconference. So I'll try to run through the bullet points of both of them. So the first meeting on April 8th, held at 1:30. Committee members in attendance were myself, Clayton Black, Alex Sostre, and Mr. Pena was excused on April 8th, but was later briefed separately on April 17th. Staff in attendance was Douglas Oldmixon, Priscilla Pfeffer, and Aretha Trice. Committee meeting was called to order by myself at 1:34 p.m. Commissioner Oldmixon explained the need for an amendment to the 2019 budget to reflect the expenses for the additional approved FTEs and provided the amended budget. He then walked the committee through the draft budget to explain expenditures and revenues as projected for fiscal year 2020. There was discussion around the need to sustain 3 new staff members and possibly an allocated staff person from reception and communication services, basically the contact center. The commissioner was requested to evaluate actual usage of the contract center for calls and emails specifically for the board. Since Mr. Pena was unable to attend, he was later updated on this as well. Then we came up with the need for a second budget committee meeting that would be called to address the issues for possibly raising fees to sustain the new staffing levels. We adjourned at 2:42. Then we met again on April 24th. So to run through those bullet points, committee members in attendance were myself, Clayton Black, Alex Sostre, and Tony Pena. Staff in attendance was Douglas Oldmixon, Priscilla Pifo, and Aretha Trice. The committee was called to order by myself once again at 2:04 p.m. Mr. Oldmixon presented 5 alternative scenarios to raise fees, and this was per the direction of this committee, and reduce reserve balances over time to ensure the cost for new staffing levels is covered for at least a 12-year period. He provided the information that the current levels of board calls and emails in the contact center justifies paying for 1.2 staff, which is accounted for in the scenarios presented. The alternatives varied by the amount license renewal fees would be raised and the timing of when increases would occur while drawing on the reserves. The committee members discussed the various scenarios and voted, with a motion from Mr. Pena and a second by myself, to send at least 2 or 3 alternatives to the full board for further consideration. And then the meeting adjourned at 3:08, which brings us to where we are right now. I don't want to get into a discussion about this, but I would like to kind of present some ideas that we have to kind of get the wheels turning and then address them under agenda items 19 and 20, which is under new business. But essentially, just to kind of elaborate in layman's terms, what we've been wrestling with here is we're trying to follow the direction of the Sunset Commission, and we've overwhelmingly heard that that is basically to increase customer service. So what we've done, essentially, and if I'm not exactly correct on all of this, Doug can correct me later at 19 and 20 whenever he gives his report. But in a nutshell, the way I understand it, we have hired 3.75 new people. Basically 1 investigator, 1 attorney, 1 legal assistant, and 0.75 person to answer phones, etc. That's basically the matrix, the way it was reallocated, etc. So what we would like some input, because the 3 of us on the budget committee, we would like input from the board on the best way to handle what we're about to talk about later on. We're going to have to raise fees. And that's kind of something that just has to happen in order to hire these new people and increase our customer service, or that's the way we see it. So we would like y'all's input regarding how to best go about that. There's basically 3 different ways that we can look at it, and I don't want to get into it too much, but the first one is right up front approach. Just go ahead and let's get the fees done right now, which would be implemented in January, I believe, but I'm going to let Doug elaborate in greater detail whenever he talks. And we're talking in the $150 range. Then the second approach would be to do kind of a 50-50 type of deal, do like a $75 the first year, $75 the second year. And then a third approach would be to wait and increase fees after 2 years. But ultimately, the way we see it, fees are going to have to increase. There's really no way around that. So this is what we would like y'all's input on and help. So since I have the floor, I'm going to tell y'all my personal opinion. I think we should just go ahead and get it done right now. But I believe that all 3, I believe Doug has even got a 4th option for us, are all viable alternatives and solutions, and there's not really a wrong answer here. So we're kind of struggling with this, and I think we didn't vote on it, but I think if we were to vote on it, we might have between Tony and Alex and myself 3 different votes, possibly. I'm not real sure. So we would like y'all's input, and I'm asking for y'all's input, and to help us go in a better direction, because we will have a committee meeting between now and August, and we would like to be able to have y'all's input today so that we can make a better qualified decision whenever we do meet in committee. So basically, that's kind of what I had to say. Before I wrap it up, I would like to say thank you to my other 2 committee members and to staff. I know y'all did a lot of work, and Alex, thank you for pushing us in the direction of getting that second meeting that we had. So a lot of hard work, and we've got to look at it in a number of different ways, and there may be some ideas that the board has and some suggestions y'all can give us that maybe can expand upon the 3 or 4 different options that we have. So I'm simply trying to kind of whet your appetite for some discussion that I would like to see in agenda items 19 and 20, which Mr. Oldmixon is going to combine. That is my report, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Black. The next item is the report by the Education Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Education Committee met on March 25th by teleconference, and the members of the committee all three of our members were in place, me, Jim Jeffries, Alex Sostra, and Joyce Janussi. The other board members weren't in attendance. No other board members were in attendance. We did have a good complement of the staff in attendance: Tony Slagle, Kristen Warman, Tony Boyer, Jennifer Wheeler, Crystal Stoll, and Dion Frederick. The public members in attendance were Joe Waller, Sylvia Busk, Glenn Garoon, Walt Sanderson, and Ruth Kelton. The committee considered several matters, including current processes for approving Appraiser continuing education, or ACE, courses, alternative processes, and whether credit cards could be accepted for approval of the ACE courses. This was a point of quite a level of consideration, and particularly around the area of the 2-hour luncheon meetings, and how that we might facilitate that in a manner that's suitable for both the folks putting on the meeting and staff approving that continuing education. The committee also discussed implementation of continuing education providers and course approvals that will become effective on September 1st of this year. Staff explained that the current processes for approving continuing education courses would remain in effect through August 31st of this year. Staff further explained that forms for the new processes will be presented to the board at the May board meeting, and we will have those later on the agenda, and that the new forms would become available for voluntary use by the continuing education providers in June, as of June 1st. Staff confirmed that testing regarding the acceptance of credit cards for continuing education course approvals was ongoing and should be available by September 1st of this year. The committee heard comments that the new processes for approving 2-hour in-person one-time continuing education course offerings were too complicated and do not allow for last-minute substitutions of instructors and course materials in the event of an instructor illness. Staff explained that the new processes were implemented to standardize course approvals for all continuing education providers and courses that traditional ACR course approvals would permit traditional continuing course approvals would permit substitute instructors in the event of an instructor illness, but acknowledged that continuing ed courses approved as a 2-hour in-person one-time offerings would not allow for last-minute instructor or topic substitutions, since those course approvals are specifically tied to the instructor, the topic, and date of offering as listed by the provider in the course application. Staff noted that such courses, if approved as a traditional continuing education course, and instead of the 2-hour that we're talking about, in-person one-time offering, could allow for instructor substitution and would not be tied to a specific course date. Based on these questions and comments, the committee asked staff to gather information about whether continuing education courses could be approved retroactively, for example, after the date on which the course is offered, for consideration by the committee at a future meeting. So we asked them to bring us some more information to make a decision in this arena. The committee did not schedule a future meeting date. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. Report from the Enforcement Committee.
So since February 8th of 2019, the February 8th, 2019 board meeting, the Enforcement Committee met on April 15th at 10 a.m. via teleconference and April 22nd at 10 a.m. via teleconference. At the meeting on April 15th, committee members in attendance were Chance Bolton, Buster Renfro, and Tony Pena. Other board members in attendance were none. Staff in attendance was Kristen Warman, Troy Bollier, Mark Lee, Melissa Tran, Christine Anderson, and Dion Frederick. Public members in attendance of the meeting were Scott DiBiasio, Victor Probant, Joe Waller, Linda Powers, Bill Beam, Robert Mormon, and Dolores Kraft Longore. The meeting was called to order at 10:01 a.m. The committee reviewed fiscal year 2019 SES staff reports as of the end of March 2019 and provided guidance that an optimal turn time or clearance rate for experience audits after receipt of an applicant's work file would be 45 to 60 days in cases without any contingent approval or hearing. The committee requested staff to modify the reports to break out internal processing times for experience audits with versus without contingent approvals or hearings. The committee received an update regarding implementation of the Sunset Commission recommendations related to enforcement, including introductions to new appraiser investigators Sylvia Shoaker and Dane Seaver, and staff attorney Melissa Tran. The committee considered articles published on the TALCB website and how to address articles with outdated content. Staff explained that the publication dates have been added to all articles published on the TALCB website, and staff is in the process of adding byline information to reflect the source of each article. Staff also explained that the website is capable of removing content older than a specified date, e.g. 2 or 5 years, but not capable of archiving such content without removing it from the website. The committee members appreciated the addition of publication dates and the byline information and agreed that adding publication dates and byline information improved transparency for persons who view the TALCB website. Therefore, the committee does not recommend archiving or automatically removing the website content older than a specific date, since such content may still be accurate and relevant. The committee heard comments from stakeholders in attendance and reviewed comments submitted in writing about appraiser performance of evaluations as permitted under federal law and whether changes adopted by the Appraisal Standards Board for 2020 through 2021 versions of the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice would eliminate certain concerns expressed by stakeholders. The committee also reviewed relevant provisions in Chapter 1103 Occupations Code and information about laws adopted in other states regarding appraiser performance of evaluations, and noted that only 8 states currently have statutes addressing appraiser performance of evaluations, and one other state appraiser regulatory agency has adopted a rule on this issue. Committee members acknowledged that the appraisal industry is evolving and haste would not be appropriate due to the complexity of this issue. The committee thanks stakeholders and staff for their comments and input on this issue and asked staff to work with the committee on possible statutory changes or rules that would allow appraisers to perform evaluations in a way that is competitive and consistent with the standards permitted under federal law. The committee tabled the discussion of enforcement committee action items from the February 2019 board meeting until a future committee meeting and requested staff to coordinate another teleconference to address the issue before the May 2019 board meeting. The committee did not set a future meeting date and adjourned at 12:35. We did, though, set one eventually and commenced a second meeting on April 22nd, 2019. The committee members in attendance were myself, Chance Bolton, Mr. Renfro. Okay, so other board member, there were no other board members in attendance. Would you like me to suspend?
Yeah, just hold for a second. We've obviously got a technical problem.
Test, test.
We had trouble with it.
Test, test.
That one's sitting up on the wall, though, with a big blank sticker on it.
I think Mr. Bolton simply needed to be able to take a breath, so he's probably got the paper underneath the counter over here, creating the static.
You should be able to go on, and then I'll come up with a solution.
Okay, thank you. Okay, to continue, staff in attendance of the April 22nd, 2019 meeting included Kristen Werman, Troy Boyer, Mark Lee, and Dion Frederick. Members of the public in attendance were Joe Waller. The meeting was called to order at 10 a.m. The committee considered the enforcement action items from the February board meeting. See the attached list. The committee agreed items 2 and 3AG related to the Sunset Commission recommendations were addressed at the February board meeting with approval of revised staff reports and the committee's recommendation for additional staff and outsourcing of commercial complaint and experience audits. New staff members were introduced at the April 17th committee meeting, and the staff reported that outsourcing proposals were being reviewed with the expectation that once proposals had been vetted and accepted, complaint and experience audit referrals could begin. The committee asked staff to report on the progress of this item at the May board meeting, and I understand they will, and also to develop and provide the board a standard report on this contract work once the work begins. The committee also discussed items 3-8, unrelated to the Sunset Commission recommendations. For item 3 through 8, unrelated to the Sunset Commission recommendations. For item 4, investigations involving active litigation, staff explained that these complaints are shown as abatements in the new case aging report. The committee requested staff to present a redacted list, including the status of those pending cases for review in closed session at the board meetings. The committee noted that no comments were received on the rule amendments proposed at the February board meeting. Staff explained that the 60-day time frame in TALCB Rule 153, TAC 15 was required by statute. So, the committee recommended that the board adopt the amendments to TALCB Rule 153, TAC 15 with the change and adopt the amendments to TALCB Rules 153, TAC 24, 157, TAC 25, and 159, TAC 204 as published. The committee discussed actions from both meetings and requested general counsel to provide a legal opinion explaining what options are available within TALCB's current statutory framework to allow appraisers to perform evaluations for consideration by the committee at the next committee meeting. The meeting was adjourned at 11:52 a.m. and did not schedule a future meeting date.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton.
Yes, ma'am.
Agenda item number 10 is the report by the Executive Committee. The Executive Committee has assembled and met 3 times since our last board meeting, March the 12th, April the 17th, and April the 22nd. In all 3 meetings, all 3 Executive Committee members were present, myself, Martha Gale Reed Lynch, and Chance Bolton. I believe that in some of those meetings we had different or varying staff members present, but generally the commissioner, Mr. Oldmixon, the deputy commissioner, and our general counsel were in each of those meetings. I'm going to summarize the meetings, so if you are interested in more detail, you might read along in the report that's actually in your package. I'll just tell you that we had conversation about the Sunset Bill, and we gave direction to the staff to revise the Sunset Report and provide clarity to the recommendations on some enforcement issues, specifically 3.6 and 3.7. We worked on some legislative changes as it related to the Sunset Bill. We considered and requested the memorandum of understanding with the Texas Real Estate Commission have some language additions to it, and those will be addressed on your agenda item number 15. We discussed the Appraisal Qualifications Board's language and submitted a letter of support and recommendation at the Aero Conference relating to comments regarding the Appraisal Qualifications Board. And we discussed the Commissioner's Annual Performance Review, which will be taken up at a later time because we have a recent placement of a new Texas Real Estate Commission chair, and he and I have agreed to jointly handle that performance review, but I agreed to give him just a little bit of time since he literally just joined our ranks about 2 weeks ago. So we agreed that we would wait until this meeting occurred and then actually have that meeting, allowing him the opportunity to circle up some information. He is, so we will be doing that soon. And that would conclude my summarized version of the Executive Committee report. Will bring us to staff reports, agenda item number 11.
Madam Chair and board members, in the spirit of exemplified by the chair, I'm going to try to summarize my remarks instead of reading 2 pages of prepared remarks. So first of all, welcome to your regular quarterly meeting. We greatly appreciate the guidance that you provide to this agency in accomplishing the mission that we've been given under the laws of Texas. We very much thank you for your service. In the last 12 months, we've been through quite a bit, and we have responded to customer feedback and sunset review issues. Most of the accomplishments have been detailed to you in our monthly reports that we provide, as well as the new customer service report that's been available since February. So together with the enhanced staffing, so we've added some additional staff, and our flexible phone system programming, recent average call hold times are actually under 5 minutes. Our goal is to sustain them at these levels and to improve them even further, while also expanding all of our tool sets to serve more license types, especially expanding them to include appraisers in many of the free services that we have designed for the larger groups of sales agents and brokers. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce and welcome some key new team members. First of all, TREC has a brand new general counsel, Chelsea Buckles, who's joining us she came originally, or her last assignment was at the General Land Office, and previous to that, she spent quite a bit of time at the Juvenile Justice Department as their general counsel and chief of staff, and then prior to that with the governor's office, both in the general counsel on their general counsel team and on the policy staff. So help us welcome Chelsea. I also wanted to make 3 announcements. First of all, Denise Sample, who has previously been the manager of our licensing function, has been promoted to the director of a new division called Licensing and Registration Services, and she has already hit the ground running, reorganized and restaffed her department, and is working directly with our deputy commissioner, deputy executive director, on enhancing the procedures that are there. So Denise, thank you for your and so all of the licensing functions fall under Denise. And then similarly, Jennifer Wheeler, who was previously the manager of our education department is now the director of the Education and Examination Services, and similarly, she reorganized and is refocusing the efforts of that division. And so, Jennifer, thank you. And so I introduced them because they're the ones who provided the reports that are in your materials today for those divisions, and so you'll have the opportunity to ask them questions. And I also, the last announcement that I wanted to make is that our very own recording secretary, Dion Frederick, is the team outstanding performer for the first quarter of this year. Congratulations to Dion. Our agency is currently focused on the final steps of the implementation of the Sunset Review process. Today, on your agenda, along with the routine business, you will ratify actions taken based on decisions made at your meeting in February, deal with other important matters that will move us forward, including updating the Memorandum of Understanding with the Real Estate Commission, consider the first draft of next year's budget and potential future uses of customer service reserve funds and fee adjustments. You'll also receive a legislative update. I am I'm happy to say that we have projected over the next few months some other significant improvements that will benefit the entire agency, including the Appraiser Board. So continued reduction in hold times based on the division of responsibilities that was directed by this board, a division of the calls and email responses to specific individuals. And so we're looking for those to continue to improve as they have since that change was implemented. We are within probably 60 days of the upload of retrievable documents into our Nubis digital repository via the VO application process. We'll be implementing, of course, the Appraiser education rules in September and transitioning the instructor qualifications to providers. We're also considering retooling the moral character determination and full implementation by the year end of FBI RAPEC capabilities to save all of our license holders significant funds. The implementation of a single sign-on, which creates the tools to allow online access account resets with no human intervention, and that's probably somewhere between 10 and 20% of all of our calls, depending on the time of the month. And a better tracking of the total time that we spend processing individual applications via some new programming, and our goal is to keep that under 10 days. So based on your requests at your February meeting, the staff reports today will be limited to the introduction of new staff, any necessary updates or clarifications that they need to offer to your materials, and answering any questions that you have. Their detailed operational reports are included in your meeting materials, along with a one-page executive summary, which hits those highlights. And so, board members, before I turn it over to them, are there any questions that I may address for you?
Commissioner, I have a couple, but certainly, board, do you have any questions of the commissioner? First is just simply clarity. The executive summary that I have, does it reflect facts for current? Are they to-date facts? It's dated March 2019.
That is correct. The full set of reports that are in there, generally the reports are compiled for the previous month's data by the 20th of the following month. And so the April reports are not yet completed. Some of the updates that you will hear from the directors where important updates are needed, they'll offer those to you orally, but the data that is there is through the end of March.
I just wanted for clarity's sake, to point that out, because that is going to, I'm going to have a couple of questions to try and get more real time.
Sure.
And then secondly, I'd like to just comment, I've only had one experience of trying to change a form inside a state agency, and it took me 5 months, and I created a monster instead of a solution. And so I will tell you that I like the looks of the new forms. I commend you all for working on them as efficiently as you have, but I will also confess that after having looked at the old format for, 5 years or more, I probably will ask questions that may be answered in these new forms periodically as I get familiar with them. So good job. I like the looks of what we're doing, and I do think the executive summary is going to serve us well. So those are my 2 comments for the moment.
All right. Well, then I will turn it over to the directors.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and board members. I'm Robert Hood, the Director of the Reception and Communication Services Division. I would like to first introduce 3 of the newest team members to the RCS division. Please stand as I call your name. Stephanie Overby. Stephanie brings 5 years of contact center experience in state government. Wanisha Robertson brings 3 years of contact service experience in state government and the private sector. And Mike Rawl brings over 20 years of customer service experience in state and private sector. Please help me welcome Stephanie, Wanisha, and Mike to the agency. In addition, we will have 2 more staff members added over the next couple weeks, and RCS will have 19 employees trained to handle calls over the next couple of weeks. Earlier this month, Mr. Slagle sent out the April customer service report, and the stats for RCS are also included in your materials. For May this far, we continue to have less than a 5-minute hold time, and as we add more employees to the team, we anticipate the hold time decreasing even more. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have on the RCS reports.
So I've got a couple. I heard you just report we're up to now 19 employees.
Correct, 19
Okay.
employees. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll have 19.
And so as we've worked through the customer service issues, one of the things we've done is created this separate queue from a board to handle board issues. How many people answer that queue? Are all those calls going to a single individual day in, day out, or are there 5 people cross-trained in our queue?
We have one person that's dedicated to handle those calls on a daily basis, and then we have a set person that's you can call a secondary person to handle if that person is out or if they're on break or during lunchtime.
Okay. I just was curious how that was working. And then finally, I'm not sure that I understand the last half of the separate queue issue where it says agent sign-out codes were created to give a clear picture of the number of hours staff spends handling calls, emails, and walk-ins. Is that something that just you're creating a report that has them allocate their time because they're handling all of these different components, or?
Yes. Previously, we weren't able to account for the number of hours someone was actually handling a phone call. So what we did was we created sign-out codes for lunches and breaks. If they're handling emails, if they're in a meeting, anything like that, we subtract the time that they're not actually handling a phone call from the time that they actually signed in for the entire day, and that gives us the amount of time someone is actually on the phone every day.
Perfect. Thanks for the elementary
hours.
education. I probably should have gotten that from the sentence, but I appreciate you explaining it to me. I understand it now. Are there other questions of the reception and communication services? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and board members. I'm Denise Sample, the Licensing and Registration Services Director, and I'd like to introduce the newest member of the LRS team, Pamela Carter. And Pamela Carter is joining us as the licensing manager. She comes to us from the Texas Department of Motor Vehicles, where she gained experience managing a large team as the Assistant Chief of Regional Services. Please join me in welcoming Pamela to the team. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about the LRS reports.
No questions?
All right.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and board members. Jennifer Wheeler, Director of Education and Examination Services. I'm just going to take a minute to tell you a little bit about the organization of the new Education and Examination Services Division. The new structure of EES includes a business process manager who will identify areas where we can become more efficient through technology and improved use of our Versa database system. We also have an education compliance specialist who will develop our long-planned vision of an audit program for education providers and courses, as well as a curriculum developer who will assist with writing, editing, and developing the exams for all TREC and TALCB non-elective courses. We have a program supervisor and 6 education specialist positions. Kim O'Connor is our education specialist dedicated to the TALCB education program. As a reminder, examination statistics are calculated and maintained monthly. Fiscal year-to-date data will be presented to this body annually as requested at the November working group meeting. If there are no questions, this concludes my presentation. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Priscilla P. Foe, Director of Staff and Support Services. I'm here to welcome and introduce Mary Beth Hanna. She is on, there she is. She may be a familiar face. She originally was in our licensing division, and since then she has not only come over to our division first as an administrative assistant in February, but then has taken on duties and moved into a different position as a purchaser with a career path, which is we're very excited about. And that is, of course, in alignment with her finance degree from the University of Texas. She's competent, she is delightful, and we're very happy she's on our team. If you have any questions of me, I'd be happy to answer them about my reports. Otherwise, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair, board members. Troy Bollier, Director of Standards and Enforcement Services. Today, I'd like to introduce our 4 new staff members who joined us. First, I'd like to introduce Sylvia Showaker. Sylvia, if you could stand up. Sylvia comes to us from private appraisal practice where she did independent residential fee work for many years in the Austin area. She's a general certified appraiser and also has a background in commercial work and mass appraisal. And we're excited to have her on board, so please help welcome Sylvia. And then on April 1st, Melissa Tran. Melissa, if you would stand. Melissa Tran is our new staff attorney, and Melissa comes to us with a background in counseling, lending and financial institution clients, and also some litigation experience. And we're excited to have Melissa join our team. She's been here since April 1st and already hit the ground running. So please help me welcome Melissa. And then in mid-April, Dane Seaver, who is our newest appraiser investigator. Dane comes to us also from private fee appraisal practice in the greater Houston area. And Dane has expertise and experience as an AQB certified USPAP instructor and a former PIC member and mentor. So please join me in welcoming Dane to our team. Then finally, our most recent addition, Jessica, if you could stand. Jessica Stevens is our new legal assistant, and Jessica is a certified paralegal, and she has a master's degree in legal studies and previously worked at the Attorney General's office and has experience in private litigation. And she started with us on May 1st, so please help me welcome Jessica to the team. And with that, we are fully staffed and pushing hard on improving our results. The one item that I did want to bring to your attention, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions about reports, is a brief update on the RFQ process. As you know from the February meeting, we've been pushing very hard to, at the board's direction, to put out a request for qualifications to obtain appraisers who can do commercial reviews, both for experience audits in particular because of our backlog, but as well as the flexibility to do commercial complaints. And I'm happy to report that right now contracts are being signed, and we anticipate putting out actual assignments to the contractors in the next week or two. In fact, I believe we've already had one signed, so we're very excited. We have a total of 5 contractors, and we're anticipating that as things progress over the summer, that we'll start to eat through that backlog. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions or concerns you might have.
Troy, can you, I notice on our report that we've got 8 responses, and you've now reported that we've got 5 contracts signed. How many RFQs went out?
I'm sorry, how many?
RFQs went out. Did you just do an all-out call to anyone that was generally certified?
Yes, ma'am. It was 1 RFQ.
Okay.
Anything else?
Mr. Boyer, on the complaint aging report, I guess on the bullet points to the right side, it says 1 awaiting disposition. Can you explain what exactly that means?
Yes, sir. So that would be a situation such as a contingent dismissal or perhaps a disciplinary situation where the staff has completed the action and we're waiting on action from someone else. And I believe this particular one was actually contingent dismissal that has now since been resolved. But for example, we might be waiting a couple weeks while they complete mentorship before we can close out the case.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? All right, thank you.
We will move to agenda item number 12, discussion and possible action to adopt amendments to 22 TAC chapters 153 through 159. Kristen?
Madam Chair and board members, Kristen Warman, your general counsel. The amendments before you today are being proposed to implement some of the Sunset Commission recommendations, specifically the amendments to Section 153.15 clarify that a failure to respond to a request for work files or the submission of experience work files that do not comply with USPAP or the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice may result in the denial of an application, whether that's an application to upgrade or an application for an initial license. The amendments also distinguish that a license holder who applies to upgrade an existing license and submits work files that do not comply with USPAP may be subject to disciplinary action in addition to the application being subject to denial. The following changes are recommended to the proposed text in subsection H2. You may follow along at page 95 of your materials. The highlighted changes are shown in yellow. These proposed changes to the text would remove the change in time period for applicants to submit experience documents to the board from 60 to 40 days, since 60 days is a statutory requirement. And they would also remove the proposed text regarding an extension of time, since applications for a license remain open for 1 year from the date of filing to allow applicants sufficient time to fulfill all requirements for obtaining a license. The amendments to Section 153.24 clarify the process and set forth the criteria for prioritizing complaint investigations for complaints against appraisers. The amendments also clarify who would sign agreed resolutions of complaint matters under Occupations Code 1103.458 and 459. The amendments to Section 157.25 clarify the process and set forth the criteria for seeking a temporary suspension when a complaint investigation is pending. The amendments to Section 159.204 clarify the process and set forth the criteria for prioritizing complaint investigations for complaints against AMCs or appraisal management companies. The amendments also clarify who must sign agreed resolutions of AMC complaint matters under Texas Occupations Code Section 1104.208. All of these proposed changes and amendments were vetted through the Enforcement Committee of the Board, and the committee recommends adopting the amendments to Section 153.15 with the changes as presented and adopting the remaining amendments as published in the Texas Register. Staff concurs with the committee's recommendation, and we received no comments on these amendments as they were proposed.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Pena.
Yes, ma'am. I move that staff is authorized on behalf of this board to submit for adoption amendments to 22 TAC numbers 153.15, 153.24, 157.25, and 159.204 as presented, along with any technical or non-substantive changes as required for adoption.
I'll second that motion.
A motion by Mr. Pena, a second by Mr. Jeffries. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes unanimously. We will move to pending business, and Mr. Garoon. We'll let you, you certainly had public comment. Would you like us to actually open the agenda item and discuss it, or would you like to comment now before we begin our discussion? Come on up.
In addition to my other activities, I serve as the volunteer, and I stress volunteer, executive director of the Central Texas chapter of the Appraisal Institute. So I do on a smaller scale what Ruth Kelton does for a lot more money than I get. I actually spoke to Ruth about these forms yesterday. I am really not as concerned with the forms as I am with the process. I've been in the appraisal industry for over 45 years, and what appraisers want is basically three things. They want to make a living, they want to avoid getting in trouble with Troy and his people, and they want an easy way of getting continuing education. And that third point is what I am concerned about, because I have listened to, and Mr. Jeffries and his committee have done a good job of running the meeting, but I was the one who brought up the credit card issue. I'm still not satisfied that that's being addressed. My situation is this. It's hard for me to get a check out of Chicago to pay a $25 fee. In fact, I think I made a comment at one of the Education Committee meetings that I would rather pay $25 myself than have to go through, it's kind of like the $75 fee, stipend that I would get for doing PIC. So here's my concern. It mainly deals with the 2-hour lunch meetings. And when I said that appraisers want easy continuing ed, these 2-hour meetings are real easy and should be. You meet for lunch, and you get 2 hours listening to current topics. The problem is the process now is fairly straightforward. And I'm seeing improvement in terms of staff getting approvals. And for those of you that don't know, basically, I fill out the paperwork. My biggest problem is getting my chapter members to get me programs, quite frankly, and there's nothing that you or your staff can do about that. So when I get that, I submit the paperwork. And then I get an approval with a number and can move along. I am concerned that we are adding steps to a process. And so I guess I'm here because I'm not getting enough comfort listening to the Education Committee and staff about what the process is going to be. I spoke to Ruth. She apparently is going to sign Region 8, which is Texas, where Texas is in the Institute, as a provider. And then, as I understand it, those of us who are executive directors or officers of other chapters will have to submit our paperwork to Ruth, who will then submit it to your staff. She will pay for the, and I'm mainly concerned with the 2-hour lunch meetings. The others, I'm really not. I understand that takes longer. But for a 2-hour lunch meeting, Ruth will submit it, and I'm afraid I lose control as the executive director. So I guess what I'm here to do, we've got forms. I'm not sure what the process is going to be, and I need some help with someone in an open meeting telling me, as the executive director of a relatively small chapter, as a volunteer, what I'm going to have to do to get my 2-hour continuing ed meetings approved. And I haven't gotten that. We're doing this effective in September. I was toying with the idea of becoming a provider, although, quite frankly, the paperwork is mind-boggling. So that's why I agreed with Ruth yesterday that I would at least attempt to give the process a chance. Can I get some help with this? I really don't know how we're going to do this. And I came down here with the idea, the other thing I just threw in because I figured I'd get Mr. Old Nixon's blood pressure up a little bit this morning. But this is what I really came here for, was because as much as I think the Education Committee wants to help, these 2-hour meetings are important to at least 1,100 Appraisal Institute chapter people who usually take advantage of them. And unless you want all 1,100 in here complaining, I think we need a process in place. I mean, the forms are fine, but I want to know what the process is. Oh, and one more thing. Let me, and I know Ms. Jackson and I maybe that's why she retired, went round and round about these 2-hour meetings. There has got to be a way to triage educational programs, because these 2-hour meetings cannot take as long to vet as a 7-hour or week-long program. They're straightforward. There's no materials in most cases. You can Google the presenters and figure out that they actually do exist. And it really shouldn't take that long. So I guess I would request that there be a little leeway given for these 2-hour meetings to get approvals outside of longer programs.
Okay. I think I understand your questions, and let me say that this is where I too am a volunteer, and so I'm going to pitch it to the folks that make the big bucks. Are there any recommendations for Mr. Garoon as it relates to answering the question that he has about what the process is and how he can move forward?
I'll happily address that. The Education Committee and staff working together have recommendations which are included on this particular agenda item. And so once the board takes its action today, I would ask if you can stay. You're welcome to meet with Ms. Wheeler afterwards, and she will answer all of the questions about how the process will work as soon as the board endorses the process.
Okay, because I'm concerned we're doing things without knowing how we're going to do them. And so that'd be great.
Okay.
And unless you run into the Fort Worth Symphony time, which starts at 7:30 tonight, and I have to get back, or she who must be obeyed will not be a happy person.
Yeah,
And I'm
understood.
more worried about her than I am about any of you. So.
As you should be.
Okay, the agenda item is open. Certainly the public request has at least been temporarily handled, and we are back to taking a look at forms. So,
So, agenda item 13, Jennifer Wheeler, Director of Education and Exams. This is discussion and possible action to approve new TALCB forms. These forms are proposed to implement the board approval of continuing education providers and courses effective September 1, 2019. The forms will be made available on June 1st to allow for voluntary compliance before the September 1st effective date. Staff recommends that the board approve these new forms as presented with an effective date of June 1, 2019, with any technical or non-substantive changes.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Jeffries.
I move that the board approve the new TALCB forms as presented with an effective date of June 1st, 2019.
A second.
A motion by Mr. Jeffries and a second by Mr. Sostry. Any questions, discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will move to agenda item number 14, discussion and possible action on legislative matters, including our sunset bill.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, board members, Tony Slagle, Deputy Commissioner. This is going to be very brief. I sent an update out on Monday that gave an update on the bills that we're currently tracking that are still alive. I did want to clarify one thing that I unfortunately misstated. I don't know if it was in a hurry in my wish that the session was over with now, but I said today was the last day that House committees could consider Senate bills. It's actually tomorrow is the last day for that to happen, so I apologize for that misstatement. But as the Commissioner sent out an email, I believe yesterday, or Wednesday, it was Wednesday, that our sunset bill has indeed passed. It should be on its way to the governor's office, hopefully for a signature. And we're all pleased that that process is winding down. The other bills on the report of interest, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any of those. I will be providing an update once we have a better idea of where those bills are in the process, and whether or not we'll be discussing internally and provide information, as well as if there's anything we need to do to move forward on any of those things. But I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. I don't want to take up a whole lot of time going over these things.
No, we appreciate the fact that you have kept us up to speed as we've been through the process, and so thank you for that. And, good news on where we are at this very moment. So thank you, Tony. Any questions for Tony?
Thank you. Thanks.
We will move to agenda item number 15, discussion and possible action regarding the amendments to the TREC TALC B, Memorandum of Understanding.
Madam Chair and board members, in your materials at page 131 and following, you will find the proposed amended Memorandum of Understanding. I want to address the areas that are where you can see the redlined version. Most of these were at the request of the board. And so, let me just address them briefly. So under section Roman numeral 4, general agreements, that second paragraph, this just documents the opportunity that has developed over time for the board members to provide input into the commissioner's performance at the same time that the commission evaluates the performance of the executive director. And since that's sounds like two people, but it's just one, that is simply documenting that practice. Secondly, under subparagraph A there, you'll see on the next page that the reception and communication services are stricken from services provided generally by the commission to the board, and that was at the board's request. The board asked that the reception and communication services be divided so that we could track specifically all of the board-related activity, and so that's removed from that area and then added into one of the measured services, which we'll talk about when we get to Exhibit A. Under subparagraph F, that is removed entirely because neither the commission nor the board, or the commission and the board have each determined that a long-term facility master plan reserve is not in the interest of the agency at this particular time, and so that's being removed from the MOU. Subparagraph G becomes F, and that section and the next subparagraph G simply clarifies that some activity that was previously, or that is allowed as discretionary activity by the executive director and commissioner on balancing support services and financial soundness, that those notices be both prior and in writing. Okay, so rather than simply doing them and informing you of them, to the extent that either one is necessary, they will be explained and requested in writing. Okay, and then the last section there under Roman numeral 5 is to amend the effective date to June the 1st, and also the remaining in effect through the end of fiscal year 2021. So typically these are in effect for a 2-year period. Of course, they're subject to amendment by the parties at any time. But in this case, because it's so close to the end of the current biennium, in which it would be up for routine renewal September the 1st, we'll just recommend that this be in effect for 27 months instead of 24. And then, of course, the new chair, Scott Kessner, his name will be substituted for Avis Wukash. And then if you will lastly turn to Exhibit A under new 1D, the reception and communications specialist, and there is a blank there. One of the things that you will note is from Mr. Black's discussion of the Budget Committee deliberations that initially when we started out looking at just the March data, when we provided data to the Budget Committee in talking about what the staffing requirements were to meet the level of calls and emails attributable to the board, that based on the ratio at that time of just the number of persons that were involved divided by the number of calls and emails, that estimate using that rough rubric, a rough calculation was 1.2 persons. 1.2 persons. And so he mentioned that because that was the data that we had at the time. I'm happy to tell you that we have developed a much finer evaluation tool, which Mr. Hood discussed in response to the chair's question. Now we're using the actual number of person hours on the phone. Okay, so it's not just the number of persons available, but the number of person hours actually engaged. And in doing that calculations for a full 2-month period, we have determined that using average for each of the months and then combining the months and doing the same calculation, in one case it's 0.71 persons, and in another case it's 0.69. So combining those two, we're recommending, and the commission has approved, subject to your concurrence, inserting 0.7%, so 70% of one person. And then we would use the average of, rather than it being that particular person, even though there is one person, there is also a backup person. Instead of using that individual's salary, we would use the average salaries of all the folks that are on the, in case over time that person changes from time to time and it's reassigned to someone else. And so we'll use, we will use the average salary and then pick a person whose salary is actually nearest to the average. So that's just internally, it's easier for us to do it that way, but really it comes down to it's 0.7 persons and the average salary is about $42,000. So 0.7 of that would be allocated under this MOU to reimbursement by the board of that person's salary to the commission. Happy to answer any questions about the MOU. The commission met on earlier this month and have approved this unanimously with that insertion.
Commissioner, I've got one question. Is there anything in any kind of a license renewal cycle or anything that might cause those to be unusually low? Meaning sometimes there might be a license, we know we are in 2-year license renewals. Are
Certainly.
there any areas, have we looked at a calendar to make sure that, we're not going to move to the next month and have that potentially reflect something that's, 2.5 times what we're looking at?
A very important clarification, because it left out something that was asked similarly at the commission, and that was a commitment on our part to review this every 6 months, to redo this calculation to determine that we stay on track, and as necessary to bring those recommendations to the two bodies if in fact there's a significant shift.
Fair enough. I know that there are some changes in the industry that could potentially have people calling in more often about appraisal qualifications and whatnot. So from a fairness standpoint, I want to be sure that we can have some flexibility to account for, and I appreciate the concept of a review every 6 months. Other questions? I do think the MOU as presented represents what we had made a gentleman's agreement, if you will, amongst us about what we felt like was a fairness aspect of dividing off some of those expenses and carrying them ourselves and receiving what we had hoped to receive, which was a dedicated opportunity for potentially our certification and license holders to maybe have a shorter wait time. So we'll see if both of those come to pass over time.
And it has actually, and I look at it every week, of course, we track that data. And so from week to week, there have been times when it has been a shorter wait time for the board based on having that individual.
Perfect.
Madam Chair, I move that the board approve the changes to the TALCB Memorandum of Understanding as presented.
A second.
A motion by Mr. Black and a second by Mr. Bolton. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Move to agenda item number 16, discussion and possible action regarding the budget.
Madam Chair, Priscilla Pifo, Director of Staff and Support Services. You'll notice agenda item number 16 with discussion and possible action regarding the amendment to the TALCB fiscal year 2019 budget. In February, the board voted to approve an amendment to the fiscal year 2019 operating budget for an additional $90,000 for commercial experience audits. The board also approved hiring 3 additional staff members who have since been hired. The proposed budget amendment would reallocate available funds from Operations and Contingencies Reserve to the operating budget to cover the costs associated with the new positions for the remainder of FY 2019 as follows: $111,600 salaries and wages, $46,872 in employee benefits, $28,528 in supplies and equipment, with a total of $187,000. There's a recommended motion before you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Bolton.
I move that the board ratify the current fiscal year 2019 operating budget to include the items listed herein with associated reserve transfer from Operations and Contingencies Reserve.
Second.
A motion by Mr. Bolton, second by Ms. Januzzi. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Move to agenda item number 17, discussion and possible action regarding the Spring 2019 Association of Appraiser Regulatory Officials ARO Conference and Regulator Training Course.
Madam Chair and board members, this agenda item is just to summarize what occurred at the ARO Conference that was held on May 2nd through the 5th in Denver. ARO is the Association of Appraiser Regulatory Officials. Your general counsel currently serves as the president-elect of that organization. And at the spring conference, or in addition to the spring conference, ARO has developed 2 courses that are available to regulators to send board members like yourselves or staff members to get more training and information about appraiser regulation. And those courses are the Regulator Training Course and the Case Studies Investigative Course, or CSI course. I'm happy to report that our chair, Jamie Wycliffe, and our vice chair, Martha Gale Reed Lynch, attended the Regulator Training Course in Denver, and that was a full 1-day course that was put on by several members of ARO from across the U.S., and including members of different boards in different states. And that regulator training course also included a case study investigation for the board members and other staff members of appraiser regulatory agencies to go through and consider all of the different ways that each state handles the various items and issues that may come before it, whether it's in an application for a license or in a complaint proceeding. And that was a full 1-day course that was held on May 1st in advance of the conference. And I'll let the chair speak to her attendance at that course. And then the following 3 days, we actually were able to attend the AQB meeting that was held the morning of the 2nd before the conference commenced. And then we heard from various members of the regulatory industry about different ongoing issues throughout the industry and the trends in the industry. as we move through that conference. And I'm also happy to report that our own Troy Boyer, Director of Standards and Enforcement, gave one of the presentations in the conference, and that was very well received at the conference. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I think the Commissioner will also speak to amending the board's policies on travel and conference attendance to allow all of the board members to attend these conferences, or at least the opportunity to attend these conferences.
Thank you, Kristen. I'll piggyback. I was in attendance, and it was helpful to go to the regulator training course. I would encourage participation if your schedule allows. It's always a challenge to carve out another 2 or 3 days somewhere, because most of us are self-employed or, not in a position to be able to be gone for that extended period of time. I will congratulate Kristen on her president-elect position. As I've said in the past, when our commissioners served in those capacities as well, in terms of leadership in Aero, I think it's important for the Texas voice to be heard. I think if you did attend those meetings, you would understand that from a base level, those are a great resource for us. And so, as in any industry, relationships are important, and the ability to be able to pick up the phone and get a different point of view from across the country, I think is helpful. And I learned something. That's always a test for me when I'm traveling off to a conference where I'm having to give up time. Was the investment of the time worth the trip? And yes, I learned things. I did say I thought that the classes that Troy got to attend, the CSI, had a snappier name and sounded like a bit more fun than regulator training, but I did have the opportunity to learn. So I would recommend that you listen and participate when you can. We have opened those opportunities up in the past, and always when we are considering the attendance of those, we have tried over the course of the last few years to move that attendance around so that we could allow the education to be spread around our board. So I'll continue to encourage you in that regard.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you that did attend. Appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to do so.
We'll move to agenda item number 18, discussion and possible action regarding the TALCB Reserve Fund investment policy.
Priscilla P. Foe, Director, Staff and Support Services. Agenda item 18, page 139 of your materials. At the February meeting, the board discussed and agreed to change the name of the reserve fund from the Long-Term Facility Master Plan Reserve to the Customer Service Reserve. The amended policy is before you for ratification, and a motion is required.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Pena?
I move that the board adopt changes to the TALCB Reserve Fund's investment policy as presented.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Pena, second by Mr. Black. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Move to agenda item number 20, discussion and possible action regarding the 2020 draft budget and budget policy.
So 19 and 20.
And we'll go ahead and open. Oh, sorry. Thank you for the correction. We will open 19 and 20 now. I got off somehow. I got ahead of myself checking things off. And so that's 19, discussion and possible action regarding the Customer Service Reserve Fund, and 20, discussion and possible action regarding the 2020 draft budget and budget policy.
Madam Chair and members, you have before you for agenda item 19 a rather detailed spreadsheet that provides alternative scenarios for potential use of the Customer Service Reserve Fund balance while raising fees to make operational changes fully sustainable. And you'll see scenarios A, B, C, and D on those 2 pages. They are If you follow along on the red highlights, that is really the information that will help you keep these straight. So I'll make a brief presentation about these particular scenarios, and then we'll talk about their impact on the budget. Scenario A, as Mr. Black said earlier, is raising the fees for the 3 license types: certified general, certified residential, and licensed residential, in one fell swoop, at one time. In this particular case, the earliest that could be accomplished would be for January of next year, but it would require, so it says fees raised in one cycle with no waiting period. Okay, so if you look towards the center of that, you also see in bold next to where it says other savings, in the center of that top box for scenario A, says the new fees would be $500 for certified general, $400 for certified residential, and $350 for licensed residential. No change to the trainee fee, which is currently $250. So that's a net increase of $140 for certified general, $90 for this is for 2-year licenses for certified residential, and $60 for licensed residential. And calculating all of those would provide sufficient revenues, combined with drawing down the customer service reserve over a 4-year period, FY20 through 23, would provide sufficient revenues where we would be able to cover all of our operational expenses for the additional 3.7 persons, if you will, and there's a little bit extra in there for a period that would, under the projections, nothing else changing, would cover us through fiscal year 32. So essentially for the next 12 years. And that's essentially what we attempted to do. If you take the exact same assumptions and add variables. So under scenario B, it's raising the fees. How much would you need to raise the fees over 2 cycles? So once or during the next license cycle, and then again in the following license cycle. So if you raised it in FY20 and again in FY22, how much would you have to raise fees to be able to accomplish the same thing, to raise sufficient revenue to cover us for a 12-year period while drawing down the reserves over a 4-year period? And that would require the same thing, raising the fees by $150 versus $140 for certified general, $100 versus $90 for certified residential, and the same $60 for licensed residential would produce the same level of revenues over a 12-year period. Okay? And so the difference there is, do we do it all in one fell swoop, or do we stage it in 2 stages? Okay, over 2 cycles. And then scenario C simply adds a different variable, and that is, what if we didn't do anything? What if we waited for a 2-year period, drew down the reserves first before we began raising fees? Then what would we have to do in order to cover all of our anticipated expenses for at least a 12-year period? And as it turns out, waiting is expensive. So when you wait, time value of money, right? The sooner you have it, the less you need of it, assuming that assuming the time value of money. So you have, if we waited for a 2-year period and then did it all at one time, The certified general would need to be raised by $160 versus $140, not waiting. Certified residential by $110 versus $90, not waiting. And a licensed residential by $70 versus $60. So all of this is really just about balancing those two considerations. We know we need to raise fees to cover our anticipated expenses over more than a decade, okay, to meet the objectives that we've been given to enhance customer service and reduce our average complaint resolution time from our current 1 year down to 6 months. And so these are the scenarios that the Budget Committee would like your input on, so that they can go back and come up with the best possible recommendation in the next budget draft round. So they would like your input and discussion on which of these scenarios makes the most sense to you individually and then collectively as a board. A couple of things that I would add to that discussion are this. One is that by the end of this year, we anticipate incorporating the reduction of monies collected from license holders for subsequent background checks. So that's in red, it says 2850. It's actually 2825. That's author error. But regardless of the timing of raising fees, license fees, we will be reducing the total amount that we collect from individuals by that amount, and that's every license cycle forever. As soon as we implement that satisfactorily, and we are working very hard to do that sooner rather than later. But certainly without fear of contradiction at this particular point, we'll have it in place by the end of the calendar year. So it's one way to temper, even if you determine that it's the best thing to do is the least amount that you would need to raise fees, the earlier you do it, the smaller the amount you have to raise. Well, and also it would coincide with a smaller total collection from license holders if we could reduce it, or when we do reduce it at the same time by not having fingerprint resubmission fees. So those are the other two comments that I wanted to offer before the board begins its discussion on this matter. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Pena.
I'll just make comments, excuse me, as to why we did have the third option. It wasn't so much to delay anything. It was more about, in my opinion, responding to the Sunset's demand about using the money that we had accumulated over the years. So we wanted there to be an alternative that would reflect, let us respond by using that money that accumulated and then begin the process of raising fees. So that was at least my intent of introducing the third option. Within our own businesses, it might be more prudent to go ahead and start immediately, and it may be that decision that we make today. However, Schedule C or Scenario C reflects just that intent, was to use the money that sort of caused this change and then begin to raise fees.
I've got a couple of basic either comments and or questions, mostly for the record. So fundamentally, I want to be sure that I understand something before I then make a recommendation. The 3.75 people that are reflected in these charts, I see that the 3 people on the chart, attorney, investigator, legal assistant. I'm assuming the 0.75 is this communications person that we've taken on the responsibility for. Okay.
Correct.
So I wanted to be sure of that first. In these assumptions, is there any assumption about contract labor regarding commercial audits?
It's already assumed that that will be outsourced.
Okay. So, and then finally, the drawdown of the customer service reserve over a 4-year period of time as an assumption, was there the methodology, was there a methodology for that, or was that something, I mean, did the committee drive that? Did you drive that, Commissioner, and was there a thought behind it?
It was just a recommendation that we not allow that to linger. You certainly could draw it down just based on the dollars over a much longer period of time.
Yeah, and again, that's really mostly for the record, right? I want to be sure that we understand that there are a lot of choices in this matrix, and so that sounds reasonable to me. And then finally, my question, because this goes to, I believe we're starting to set some expectations when we begin to talk to the license holders about fee increases, keeping in mind those are 2-year cycles, right? So a $500 license fee is really $250 a year?
Correct.
Okay. And then why, when we talk about a reasonableness aspect, why is the term 12 years used? Is that just something because we're trying to get past a decade, or?
We assume that there will be some increase in the amount that we pay these individuals over time.
Agreed.
Okay, and so building that into the formula, we get out to about 12 years before we run out of money and need to think about adjusting fees again. Just using those basic assumptions. Now, obviously, other things could intervene where we need to look at that sooner. Obviously, economics. If the number of license holders fell dramatically or increased dramatically for a variety of reasons, all of those things are variables. But this is just given us a set of assumptions. How do you model what that looks like before we pick this kind of a reasonable number based on assuming that their pay increased by about 3% per year over this time, then fixing that fee at one time, how long would you go before you needed to address it again? And so the 12-year period seemed to be a fair assumption. Beyond that, it's really difficult to do with any kind of, specificity.
And I agree. I just, again, don't want to set an expectation. I don't believe that even if we made all of these changes, that it would be accurate for anyone to assume that sometime in the next 12 years something else won't change.
Sure.
But all of us, we are subject, this organization is subject, just like the world is, to health insurance costs and things that we can't control that could dramatically affect it. And so it may be that the fees could and certainly would be adjusted at the discretion of future boards in a shorter period of time. But I appreciate all of that clarity for the conversation's sake. And that being said, I do think that the Budget Committee's was given a lot of heavy lifting, and I appreciate the fact that you've had a lot of meetings to kind of get it narrowed down to the versions that we have before us, because I'm sure that there were lots of other options. I would say that I think probably each of us would come to a different conclusion as we look at these, and so that might be interesting to begin to get an open public discussion going about what the options are. I'm inclined to say in the current times that I would lean towards making a change sooner rather than later for a lot of reasons, mostly that most of the information we have regarding the need of staffing changes and whatnot are real time right in front of us, and they have been publicly discussed a great deal over the last 12 months for sure, and so it's a good justification, and it makes the number smaller. I do like the conversation about drawing down the dollars quickly rather than dragging them out, and so I do think that a choice of something shorter as it relates to the reserve fund is probably wise in terms of the recommendations or options to us. So those are my thoughts. Mr. Chair of Budget, I know that you've expressed already that you think each of your members would have a different opinion, and so I'd love to hear all of those, because quite frankly, you all have the hours invested in forming your opinions, and so.
Well, possibly we have differing opinions. I don't know. That I'd love to hear Alex and Jim and Joyce. I'd love to hear everybody's opinion, but I already gave y'all my opinion to make it
now
black
the
and white.
argument on time value of money. You're going into the banker room. If you let me keep my 510 for 2 years, I can turn it to 550.
Right.
So
No, absolutely.
You're backwards on that.
Yeah.
We don't get to make high interest rate loans. We only get to make treasury bill investments.
I think if we don't get a little bit of input from the rest of the board today, we're still going to struggle with making. We would like to have some help from y'all.
We're going to give you that. Tony, what do you think?
Well, I think, like I said, on scenario 3, I think you have to look at the larger picture. You don't have to, but what we were looking at is we were, through the sunset recommendations, this money was identified as being, I don't know if it's problematic, but it was, we needed to change directions with it. And if it's viewed that if we go early, it could be viewed that we are, again, accumulating money that we don't necessarily need. I would probably, within my world of banking, I would probably recommend to customers or whomever to bite the bullet sooner rather than later. But without the other variable being in place, that being the money that's already there and it's been kind of enforced upon us to use, that's why we have the third scenario. So it's two worlds converging here. And, Clayton's world and my world, we would say, get it over with early. But I think it's out of respect for what we've been asked to do and the variables that we have. Option 3, to me, seems like that meets what we're asked to do.
Okay.
Not so much the best, but it just fits.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Jeffries?
I'd like to weigh in from the appraiser side of the equation here. I think that I really appreciate all the hard work the Budget Committee's done, and I'm sure that was a tough assignment, and I think the alternatives that we have out in front of us are something that's been well thought out and responsive to the needs for the future. I would point out that we're going to have a sales job to convince our licensees to. They really don't have no choice, but on the other hand, if my math's correct, we're looking, if we do it in one fatal swoop, it's about almost a 39% fee increase, which I think is pretty tough nut to crack across the board. So I think we will have, this has to be well vetted to the license holders and demonstrated why we need this and the fact that we're all obligated to contribute. But in that vein, I would like to express my opinion that after trying to look at this as closely as I could in the time frame that we've had and not had all the benefit of the budget committee that's just eaten slip this for a long time, that maybe scenario number 2 might be a little bit more palatable. We take over a 4-year term, we get a $75 increase in one 2-year term and a $75 increase in another year term. It doesn't take much to figure out that in the end we're going to pay a little bit more, but I think from a public relations point of view and just from an appraiser on the street point of view, I would like to see us have the increase as tolerable as we can, and that would be my opinion. I have nothing against the 140 up front scenario 1 personally, but I think across the board, it might be a bit more palatable if we went the 2-year or the 2-cycle process scenario. Thank you.
Jim, thank you for giving us that opinion, because that's a very clear opinion, so thank you. And let's keep it going.
And I just wanted to add also that in the discussions with the committee, that was one of the, we weren't as a committee trying to pass the buck as far as getting a recommendation over to the board. It just so happens that on the committee there are no appraisers. We're all the non-appraiser members of the board. And so we wanted to make sure that we got the input from Mr. Jeffries and the other appraisers in the board with respect to the optics of the whole thing. One of the scenarios that we're looking at takes into account that essentially we've got a reserve fund that we've built up over the years that has been characterized in a negative way of monies not having been used appropriately to address, customer service needs. And so from an optics standpoint, one of the things that the committee discussed was perhaps drawing down those funds first, signaling to the public that, hey, before we hit you with these fees, we're gonna go ahead and draw down the funds and do what we can to pay for, what is perceived, at least by the Sunset Committee, as being, mistakes made on the customer service side. And so from an optics standpoint, that might be a better way of selling these additional fees. Now, when you look at it, when you look at the numbers doing it that way, then ultimately the fees will be higher than pulling the Band-Aid off immediately. I think that I advocated initially of maybe spanning it out in 2 separate fee increases rather than 1. But again, not being an appraiser, none of us being appraisers, we wanted to hear the feedback from the appraisers because you guys are out there, you're speaking to the folks. I know that it's been quite a long time since fees have been increased, but I also know,
I thought that was to get on the record, so thank you for bringing that up. Can you tell us when the last fee increase was, Commissioner?
Yes.
10 or 12
yes,
years.
It was in September, it was in 2009. So 10 years ago.
And I do think that's a good point. While I am not minimizing what you're saying, Mr. Jeffries, I do think that if you actually average that out over a long period of time, it's not nearly as dramatic as it sounds, but I do understand when you have to cut the check, it feels differently.
Also, we might want to also emphasize that probably the appraiser's fees haven't gone up since 2009 either.
And I asked that same question to Doug during our committee as well, and that's kind of my thought on it. So if I could speak a little bit to scenario A, just to kind of pitch that angle. The reason I'm going with that is we are directly trying to increase our customer service. I mean, that's the directive. And so we've hired 3.75 new people. And so to me, we should start seeing, or the appraisers should start seeing, or if they're not already, increased customer support. So I would say, striking right now while the iron is hot, so to speak, to me, I don't know if that's the right terminology, but basically just get it over with right now. As opposed to waiting it out. And one of my thoughts on that is if we wait 2 years, or even if we do it in a 2-stage implementation, it might be harder to sell 2 years down the road to the appraisers that, hey, well, you remember 2 years ago you got all this increased benefit, customer service, but if we do it right now, yes, it is a little more of a bitter pill to swallow, but ultimately we do have to raise the fees. I don't see that there's any way around it. I mean, we've got to do it, so it's either pay me now or pay me later, and I just feel like from my standpoint, if we do it all at one time right up front, whenever they recognize the increased customer support, it's a little easier, and I would think, to sell it in that direction, if you will, as opposed to waiting 2 years and saying, well, they're going up again? Well, why? Well, you remember 2 years ago, whenever you were on hold for X amount of time, and now it's way down and you're getting a lot better customer service. But once again, this is just my opinion, so I'm glad we're having this discussion.
So I appreciate all the jump in, and Mr. Sostre, I apologize for hijacking your comments because I felt like getting the the history lesson on the record was important, so I do want to pitch it back to you. I don't think you were finished.
Let me see if I can retrace my footsteps here. No, what I was saying was that I think that the appraiser's opinion is important, and I'll probably defer, pretty much to a lot of what you all have to say on the matter, because as an attorney, I'm not going to necessarily be face-to-face with folks in the industry on a regular basis, and so you'll have a better opportunity to have that sales pitch. And so it's something that has to be done. All good points about pulling the Band-Aid off now, because the benefit of what we're doing is immediately going to be seen by folks and felt by folks now. And I believe the numbers bear out that would probably get us the furthest as far as the funds that we have in reserve if we do this all in one shot now. So there's a lot of benefits to doing that. Just as a board, we need to be mindful of the optics of it, and that we're going to have to be able to convey that message to our stakeholders.
So, Mr. Sostre, I'd tell you that a couple of things. Number one, we can probably arrange for you to be face-to-face with the appraisers when the time comes.
No comment.
But number two, no appraisers on the committee is kind of an interesting concept, right? And I will tell you that appraisers have a tendency, well, let me speak for myself. Analysis paralysis and hesitation to make the changes that need to be made. Okay, I've seen some of that in my historic service, right? Because none of us want our fees to go up. And I think that's evidenced by 2009 to today, a decade later, having not addressed those. So it was a bit purposeful that your subcommittee is made of a banker, a lawyer, and a businessman. Because we know that you're just going to make a recommendation, right? And then there's a whole bunch of appraisers that are going to ask you hard questions. And so
I'll add to that in the grand scheme of things, the increases that we're requesting as a board are really a nominal amount. But as we all know, when fees come from state agencies, even if it's for $5 or $10, people tend to get angry. They hate to pay that for when it comes to agencies of the state and that kind of thing. So, but in the grand scheme of things, I think most people will understand what we're doing and recognize that it's really over a 2-year period. It's not such a huge hit.
I agree with you, and again, I've got a couple board members that haven't commented, and I intend to give you those opportunities. And I would just tell you that all we can all bring to this discussion is what we understand from our history. And I've served as a public official who spent a lot of time trying to keep taxes down. And today, in today's environment, that's all we hear is the very public outcry to don't raise taxes. I served for a very long time with a fellow council member who said every fee you increase is a tax as well. And I don't disagree with any of those statements, but in an effort to always do the politically popular thing, we found ourselves 12 months ago considering a fee decrease. I want to remind you all of that because in that process at that moment in time, I was thinking, are you kidding? I'm now the person who's paying or getting the benefit of a fee decrease, and I spoke directly to my budget chair and said, don't decrease my fees, answer my phone call when I call in. So we found ourselves in a position of trying to make a popular decision, and it happens all the time in the real world, and creating our own nightmare. And so I want us to be cognizant of that as we know what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to bite a bullet because we can't continue to provide customer service at a 15-minute hold time. We're not going to do that. We've committed to not doing that, and so we're going to have to deal with it. Now, that being said, I'm going to promise to try really hard to let both Mr. Bolton and Ms. Yanuzzi speak without me weighing in.
Thank you. I did have just a couple of comments. I agree with there's probably a need to raise fees. I'm not in favor of doing this now. I think the reserves that we have need to be used first because of the comments that were made from the Sunset Commission. And I don't know if raising it 75 per year, I mean, could you not do it at 50 per year over 3 years just to make it the pain a little less painful? And then would the appraisers absorb that fee increase, or would they pass that on to their customers? Because it
try.
But do you if there is a fee increase, do you raise the price of your appraisals to help offset that and absorb that?
Well, I
cost?
think it depends on what arena you're in, but it is very competitive and probably not. But, well, I'm gonna let you finish.
No. Since I'm not an appraiser, I did want to ask that question. And the other question I wanted to ask was, because we were hammered on the customer service and the high call time, but yet the staff salary has an attorney, an investigator, and a legal assistant. So I didn't see anything about customer service.
Well, so the customer service picked up by changing.
Just wanting to make sure.
Yeah, but changing the way we did it. And let's go back to fees, because I think that's a proper question, right? And I will tell you that the three appraisers that are present today, and in fact, 4 of the appraisers that serve with you don't do the kinds of work that the vast majority of the people that we are regulating do. So the volume of the number of residential appraisers in the industry is dramatically higher than the number of general appraisers. I can only speak to, and I don't do house appraisals very often. I do just enough a year to figure out, how to continue to do them correctly. But I'm also active on the real estate side, and while I do not believe residential appraisal fees have gone through the roof, nor do I think they are reflective of a 39% increase in a year-over-year basis, I will tell you that I think we are paying more for residential appraisals out in the brokerage field. Whether or not the appraiser is getting those dollars is always another a question for the industry, right? The appraisers may very well say, the fees have gone up, but I'm not the one getting them. But I will tell you from my perspective, and I suspect the 2 gentlemen I'm sitting here with would say as well, I hope we're not receiving exactly the same dollars we were receiving in 2009. I couldn't run my business if I hadn't had some revenue increases, either by creating efficiencies and thereby reducing expenses, or by raising fees. So from the general certification side, which has one of the larger dollar amounts being impacted, I can't imagine that somebody's going to sit at their desk and say, okay, I do 38 appraisals a year, divide by, the $140 that we're proposing an increase, and raise their fee to offset that.
No, I figured that it would get increased, and I understand that the cost is going to go up between 2009 and 2019. I think for me, I think the biggest sticking point is the fact that we have the money in the reserves. And we're looking to raise these fees after it was publicly stated that we were not using money that we had in the bank, so to speak. And I would be more in favor of using that the first year, letting our appraisers know statewide that there will be a fee increase coming, but do it incrementally to be able to provide customer service as we continue our population increase as well.
Good points. Thank you.
And thank you, Joyce, for that clear opinion as well.
Clayton, before I make my comments, I do have a question about the reserve, and so how exactly is the reserve being in, let's look at scenario number A. How exactly is that reserve? And I see how it's being broken down, but what's the utilization of that $308,000 in year 1?
I think I have a good answer, but I think I would let Doug, he put these scenarios together. I think he'll probably do a little better explanation than I can do.
Sure. It's simply allocated, it's removed from the reserve and put into operations. When we get to the budget, you'll see that it's actually based on both sustainable expense increases and some one-time things, that there's actually like $400,000 that's needed to be transferred in order for us to have a balanced budget next year.
Okay, so here are my thoughts on this, is that I'm just going to go through some bullet points. Is that one, that I think most appraisers, that at least that I've encountered, kind of consider this agency as a necessary or even perhaps an unnecessary evil that they have to contend with. I believe that appraisers do want better customer service from this agency, but most of them interact with us once every 2 years when they renew their licenses. So I'm not sure that we're on the forefront of most appraisers' minds on a daily basis. I think that leads to whatever increase we have, and whenever we have it, it's going to be bristling. It's going to be, my fees have increased. But I think it's necessary. And I think we have a clear mandate, not only from the Sunset Commission, but I think from the governor's office as well, to improve our services. And so I think is important, and when we implement this, because that mandate's now. And I think that also, right now, times are relatively good. Appraisal work is flourishing. There's a lot of activity. And it's relevant today. If we're saying we fixed the problems or made them better today, but we're implementing a year or a fee increase in 2 years or down the line, when we get to that point, they're saying, why are we increasing fees? Well, 2 years ago, we told you we made it better. I don't care anymore. I think it's relevant, and so my recommendation would be that let's go ahead and bite the bullet now. But I do think Jim was right. You got to sell it. You're going to have a PR campaign that explains to your stakeholders exactly why this change is occurring. So that's my recommendation.
So if I'm clear, then which I think I'm getting, you're basically recommending scenario A.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you, Chance, for that very clear opinion as well. Sounds like we've got split decisions still.
Two things I guess I would add to the mix. One is that we actually did model for the Budget Committee a 3-stage over 3 cycles. And they essentially said that's just way too long to do the recovery. And so that was, as you heard Mr. Black say, we provided 5 scenarios. That was the 5th scenario. So
we tried to take the top 3, out of committee and then present it to y'all. One other comment I would like to make, just relative to the board, is we're missing 2 instrumental board members right now that I would love to hear from Buster and Martha Gale. So I'm glad we're having this discussion. Let's continue with it.
So generally, what you were trying to do is get enough direction from the board to be able to come back or to finalize your draft budget. Correct? Is there anything that would prohibit the 2 missing board members, since we didn't get a proxy from them, right? Can they call in to the commissioner and give him some input after they've had an opportunity to watch this video and or review the materials?
I would love that. And
well, let me ask General Counsel, what can...
No, there would be... No, Madam Chair, there would be no obstacle that would prevent those 2 members who are absent today from reviewing the materials, reviewing the video discussion of the meeting today, and then either calling the commissioner, myself, or the chair of the Budget Committee to give their input individually about the scenarios.
Okay. So I think you can get that, Clayton, is my point. And, I don't know, do you have a tally down there? I know you were keeping track.
Okay, so. Yeah, I'm kind of, all right. Jim, it sounds to me like scenario B, Joyce is kind of scenario B, but it's definitely not do it all right up front. Then Alex, I'm not sure if it's B or C down there, but it's not A, most certainly, but it's a delayed approach. Which one would you prefer, Alex?
No, I actually, I'm a little torn, and the torn position is B. Taking into account the idea that I think the optics of it, of us having $1 million in the bank that were perceived to be misused, and then not using some of that up front first, and then moving the fees, spreading it out a little better. I think that's a good middle ground for a wishy-washy board member on this.
Yeah, no, that's kind of what I had you as. That's what I was thinking, a B as well, and then Chance is an A. Jamie, do you have a clear?
Yeah, if I wasn't clear, I generally lean to the A primarily for the reasons that we've talked about, but I certainly give weight and value to what's been said. When we speak to the improperly used funds, I want to be clear, they were really just unused funds. They were being set aside for a project that we have decided is not justifiable. And so I could certainly get on board with B as easily as I could A, but in either case, I also give great credence to what Mr. Jeffrey said. If I just say A, I'm not saying it's A and we don't have to do a sales job. As we roll this out, we need to remind the people that we are licensing that it has been a decade. You haven't had a fee increase in a decade. It is for a 2-year license cycle. So, what we call it, I don't think is going to make much difference. And quite frankly, again, having done this for a long time, I don't think it would matter if we said, quite frankly, I don't think it'd matter if we said it was $50. And then 2 years from now, it's going to be $100. And 2 years from now, it's going to be, $150. Or if we just said it's going to be $150, meaning I think we're going to get negative pushback, and I understand and expect that. It's a matter of, do you want to drag that out for 6 years? Or do you want to do that, or 3 years, or whatever? Or do you want to do that and hopefully prove ourselves up front? And again, I'm fine with either A or B. So let's just say I picked B for a minute so that for the sake of your matrix down there that you're working on, Mr. Chair, what would that look like?
All right, so a B, scenario B, all right, and then Tony, I'm thinking you're a B as well.
I'm a B, C.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have him as a C,
side,
so.
But really, the argument is more about the optics, and from a pure business standpoint, I'd go A, but that's not really where we're operating from. So I would just say a B, C, or CB would be where I'd go, with the variables that we have here.
Okay, and I'm a scenario A. My world's black and white, so I kind of have to agree. Any of these options are viable to me. They're all good options, so I don't think any of them are bad. So
it looks like maybe we've helped you narrow at least down to 2, and maybe with the input of the other 2 board members, you can.
It'd be impossible to ask the appraiser which check here if you want to pay now or pay later. You can't build a scenario and a model, and thanks to Doug for building the model, because that's the heavy lifting in this that you had to do and you did do for us. Is we had it in place, and all we really had to do was kind of follow along, connect the dots, and we have 3 choices now. That's 3 good choices.
I'm kind of thinking we've got it down to 2, it sounds to me like, but A or B. But I'd like to hear from the other 2 board members. I think that would be fantastic. Weigh in, and we're still gonna have a little bit of trouble, Alex and Tony, between.
While I think that feedback from the other 2 board members would be beneficial, of course we need to make a decision as a committee on what to recommend in our next meeting. So at the end of the day, we're going to have to make the call, because the more we delay, as I understand it, the more expensive it gets.
Here's the, that is absolutely true. The more we delay, the higher the fee needs to be. That is true. What I would implore this understanding that the staff and the budget committee will work throughout June on the next version. And that version is going to have a recommendation to you that has this selection embedded to bring alternative budgets in August is not viable.
No,
Okay.
and we understand that. I
Okay.
think we're fixing to help you with that. Chance had an idea, so
Madam Chair, I'd like to maybe, at least by hand or maybe by comment, survey appraisers in the audience that might be interested in weighing in on the direction that we're at least looking at pursuing. Anybody be interested in giving an opinion or suggesting one of these options they might like?
Just do it.
Just do it. Just get F.
So we got one option F. So how many appraisers are in the audience, if you don't mind us asking? Joe, you're not going to claim your your title? I thought, gosh, we've already lost one. He's moved right on off. Okay. And so if A or B were your two options, let's just say A, which one would you? How many of you would pick A? Okay. And if B were the option? Okay. And so I also agreed. And I also hear clearly the commissioner's concern. We can't really we can't separate this assembly and then stay on task without giving the budget committee some recommendation on where to go. So here's the way I see it. And again, we're here. We proposed a reduction, Mr. Garoon, last year, but I don't believe that, was it 2 years ago that we took it?
I'll address that. In 2011, when we gained SDSI status, we actually did a temporary increase of $10, and then we reduced it by over 2 cycles. We reduced it back to the previous number. So that was a temporary. But the $50 increase was in 2009. That was the last big one.
Well,
the other one was a $10 increase, sorry.
Well, so I now understand that there's a question about, what action do we really need to take? Obviously, we want to give you the direction that you need. We also we give great credence to the three of you and the amount of energy you've invested. Based on the feedback you've received from the assembled board that's here, are you, the three of you, of a like mindset?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any action that we need to take on 19 or 20 right now to address that, but my intention was to do just what we did. And to answer your question specifically, I still think we're kind of, torn between A and B, actually.
My only caution is you can't leave here that way. We've got to make a decision, and so I think the majority of the people have expressed a B opinion today.
And I think a majority of the committee as well.
Then I think we have enough information to move forward then with our committee and make a decision that we can come to a committee and bring it to y'all at the next board meeting.
And I would encourage the outreach to the two missing parties, right? Because we want to get them on board. Not that it's going to change anything, because we need to give staff direction on how to prepare a draft budget. Because we need to be looking at a budget in August. We can't be looking at 3 different budgets. And that's even more unfair, I think, to our license holders, is to continue to leave them in flux. So,
two things that I would one is just a piece of information, if you would like, but we certainly could do a very simple A/B poll of our license holders. That's not a very difficult thing to do. Just using like SurveyMonkey.
Yeah, but how scientific would it be?
That's right. It would not be. It'd be only to the appraisers, and it would be those who chose to answer. So I'm not suggesting that it's something we should do. What I was just saying is that in the same way that Mr. Bold said, how many do we have in the audience and what was their preference, we could do that with a larger audience. That's a possibility, just factual possibility.
And that also might delay, you know, the process as well. So I think we've got enough information we can make a decision.
And the other thing I just wanted to inform you of is that with respect to the budget, when we bring it, we'll also bring, in order to have the fees that are embedded in there, we'll have a fee rule proposal at the August meeting that will have either, you know, it'll have the timing of whatever's embedded in the budget, okay, in the rule.
Well, thank you for everyone for weighing in the audience and board members alike. Everyone, thanks a lot. This helps us out.
Perfect.
I'd like to also just thank our committee chair as well for the work he's done.
Well, you're welcome. It's been a lot of fun. I've had a lot of help from staff.
Well, we are always lucky that way, that's for sure.
So, Madam Chair and members, moving on then to essentially answer your questions. I'll make a brief presentation and then answer any questions that you have about the budget draft, the first draft of the budget that is included in your materials at page 155 and 156. Is also included in there at 157 through 160, the current budget development policy, along with an appendix, Exhibit A, that has the calendar, if you will, that corresponds to the policy itself, the language of the policy, the deadlines for all the various steps. And so this is the result of the two meetings that we talked about previously and a whole bunch of work by the staff. Recall that the first draft of the budget is less precise than the next draft will be because it is based on 6 months of actual expenditures and 6 months of projected expenditures and revenue, same way. So 6 months of actual and 6 months of projected. The next version will be based on 9 months of actual and 3 months of projected. As the process develops, we will then, after the fiscal year is closed out, when you vote on the budget in August, that's what will go into effect September the 1st, but the prior year numbers will not actually be known until we close out the fiscal year. And so that happens in late September, and we report that to you. We'll report we call it the trued up last year's numbers, along with the annual review at your workshop in November. Okay, just to let you know that. That is the source, that true up is the source of the $187,000 that was available to be moved from excess in operation and contingency reserve to cover the 6 months of expenditures, why we could hire people sooner, okay, rather than wait for a specific. That we actually ended up taking in more revenue and expending less than was included in our prior year budget. Okay. So if you will, look at page 155, and we'll focus on the columns budget for FY 2019, estimated FY 19 actuals, and then proposed FY 2020. And then, of course, you can see the variance is the next column there as well. So in the development the budget development policy, we're required to provide you 5 years of data, and we do in this draft. So you amended the budget in February by taking some additional funds from the unallocated portion of the education reserve and moving that into help to cover the expenses of outsourcing the commercial audits. Okay, so that is built into, that original budget amendment is built into this FY19 budget number. When you see the next draft of the budget, it will include the amendments that you approved today as well. So under, I think it was agenda item 14 or so, we amended the budget today. 16? Okay, that'll be included in there. So we go through and make the best estimates that we can for the amount of expenses. Of course, the salaries and wages, it will include those 3 additional persons. They're already built in there, as well as a 3% increase on the baseline, but with a corresponding increase in benefits, and then the retiree insurance remains about the same, as you can see. Professional fees and services, that includes the new money for the commercial appraisal reviews, and it assumes that all of those will be outsourced in the next fiscal year as well. We increased the amount of the proposed budget for travel related, and that is to allow additional opportunities for board members to attend aero conferences and training. One of the things that I would like to point out to you about that is that we actually have appraisers. The appraisers in Texas, of course, pay an appraisal registry fee. A portion of that, of course, that funds the appraisal subcommittee, and a portion of those fees that collected nationwide by the appraisal subcommittee are given in a grant to the Appraisal Foundation to conduct investigator training at no cost to those being trained or providing that training. That training is open to, and we have made great use of it, all of our legal staff, all of our legal assistants, and all of our investigators have attended. There's 3 portions of that training, and so it is simply expected that as a part of their staff development that they will go to that training. Also, our general counsel has been to those. I wanted to let you know it is also available to board members. Okay, and so that is when I say at no cost to you, it's at a cost. I mean, it is a part of the fees that are already collected by the appraisal subcommittee and then included in this grant to operate this program. So that, so please don't ever feel like you're imposing if you want to take advantage of that training opportunity. We are guaranteed in each class at least 2 seats. We're given preference on 2 seats. And if we can't take them, then they're offered to others. And sometimes there are other states that don't take them, and so we get to send additional people as well. So it's kind of a first come or kind of right of first refusal. So we'll let you know as those come up. Not this particular cycle. 1, 2, and 3 are, I think, in June, August, and October, something like that. April, June, and September? Yeah, something like that this year. So we did not, we didn't get that information out to you as expeditiously as probably we should have to let you know that that opportunity was available. But we will promise to do that in the future. But we also, and that just brought up this, one of the things that with your concurrence on this, we're going to pull all of those related policies that are found in other places today and put them into a proposed participation in aero policy that will be up for your consideration. We'll put the draft to the executive committee with their permission, and then if you want to bring it forward to the full committee, the full board in August, it could be considered then. Let's see, what other things are there significant here? It's primarily, those are the two largest. The communication services, we did actually include an additional meeting for the budget. As you recall, last year, as we went through the sunset process, we had 2 special meetings that were last year, and so we wanted to make sure that not only the workshop is included, but also the opportunity to include in the budget 1 additional meeting. So that is in there as well, all the related expenses for that. And we recategorized the CoStar appraisal research subscription into, let's see, into this category. Or sorry, it was moved to contracted services. Let's see here. Okay. On the expense side, you can see the vast majority of that is personnel related. On the revenue side, so any questions about expenses before we move on? On the revenue side then, the license fees are based on the policy that was changed in November based on Sunset staff recommendations, and that's why we included the policy, the budget development policy here, but it was, it asked us to, or the decision that you made was to project revenues not based as conservatively as we had previously, but based on a 5-year average. And so that's what we have essentially done here and included that. We also, let's see, AMCs, of course, are handled a little differently just because the majority of the AMCs renew in the even-numbered years, so we have the largest amount of revenue, but we have to carry that forward for, it needs to cover a 2-year period, and so we do, we add the 2 projected years and then divide it in half and carry from the fat year to the lean year, okay, from the excess year to the shortage year. And then other miscellaneous revenues include, the majority of that is actually interest on our current reserves. As you can see with this proposed budget shows with carrying forward $250,000 into next year based on the AMC revenue carry forward requirement in order to balance the budget for this projected year. We would need to move $410,000, okay, from reserves in order to balance that budget. So that's what that currently shows for our, draft 1 of the budget. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about this draft. Okay.
We don't need any action on this.
No action is required. The additional direction that was given, so the additional direction that was given to the committee about how to deal with the personnel expenses and potential fee revenues and the allocation of reserves based on that model is what we were looking for to implement into the second draft, along with the actual numbers for 9 months versus 3 months of projected. So that'll be helpful. No other action is required unless Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Lots of information. I think that's probably why you see the crossed eyes and silence. We're trying to absorb all that we've received. Okay, so we are moving to agenda item number 21, and let me just announce to the board, who understandably is squirming in your seats, right, that my goal is to see what the next 15 minutes brings for us, right? But I will promise you this, if we don't get through in the next 15 or 20 minutes or appear like we're going to, I'll take a break so that you can have some relief. Unless you want to take one now, which I recognize you may need to.
I think I can wait it out another 15 minutes.
Okay, so let's move to agenda item 21, discussion regarding performance review and salary of TALCB Commissioner. I will report to you that we have had some conversation with the placement of the new Texas Real Estate Commission chair, and our goal is to have the review jointly with the commissioner, and we intend to do that sometime in the next couple of weeks. And so I don't really have a report for you other than the information that you have received collectively about the combined scores that you've turned in as it relates to the reviews. Are there any questions about the intentions and the current state? And Commissioner, in case we haven't officially informed you, I know Scott and you and I have informally been speaking, but that is our intention. I wanted to give Scott an opportunity to get through his first board meeting before we ask him to do something else, and then he and I agreed that in light of the fact he was gathering additional information from some of his commission that he might need a week or 10 days, so that's our intention there. Discussion regarding possible action regarding the Appraiser Qualifications Board's first exposure draft of a proposed interpretation of real property qualification criteria and TALCB comments is your agenda item number 22.
Madam Chair and board members, the Appraiser Qualifications Board released the first exposure draft, which is in your materials starting at page 163, on April 3rd of 2019. The issue that the AQB was attempting to address appears on page 167, and it relates to the criteria's requirements for supervisory appraisers. Those requirements, if you look on page 166, at subparagraph Roman numeral 1B, those supervisory appraisers must be in good standing for a period of at least 3 years before being eligible to become a supervisory appraiser. And they shall not have been subject to disciplinary action. And what's important is the word any in line 27. Any disciplinary action within any jurisdiction within the last 3 years that affected their legal eligibility to engage in appraisal practice. So if there was a disciplinary action, that individual would need to wait 3 years from the conclusion or from the last date of that disciplinary action before they could then become eligible to be a supervisory appraiser. That's the language that is currently in the criteria today, and the language on page 167 was what the AQB proposed, which was really an interpretation that their intent was not to say any disciplinary action, but simply to say any substantive disciplinary action would not result in that 3-year period of ineligibility to be a supervisory appraiser. So for example, if your license was suspended temporarily because you failed to pay your fees to renew that license, then the AQB was proposing an interpretation that non-substantive disciplinary action or suspension would not prevent you from maintaining your role as a supervisory appraiser. The board supported this proposed interpretation and submitted comments to the AQB in support of this interpretation. Those comments appear beginning on page 168 of your materials. That letter was sent in. In addition, as you heard earlier, we were present, or some of us were present, for the AQB meeting in Denver prior to the start of the Aero conference, and the chair of the board got up and expressed these comments in that meeting as well. What you will see in the comments is not only support for that proposed interpretation, but a request that the AQB actually go farther, one step farther, and change the language to remove the any disciplinary action and make clear in the criteria itself that it's for a non-substantive, or that the suspension of the 3 years of eligibility to be a supervisory appraiser would only be imposed for a substantive disciplinary action and not for a non-substantive or administrative disciplinary action. Well, the appraisal subcommittee actually agreed with that position taken by the board in its comments and informed the AQB that they could not simply interpret the language in the criteria to mean something other than what it actually said, and that the AQB actually needed to propose changing the language in the criteria. So that is what they will do. They will release another exposure draft to move forward with their proposed change. So that will be forthcoming, and we just wanted to give you an update on where that stood since the board had submitted comments on that proposed change to the criteria. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hearing none. We'll move to agenda item number 23, discussion and possible action regarding the Appraisal Qualification Board's discussion draft with regard to practical applications of real estate appraisal.
Madam Chair and board members, again, this item is another exposure draft, well, actually a discussion draft released by the Appraiser Qualifications Board. As you may recall, when the Qualifications Board amended the criteria, they also discussed creating a way that trainees could earn experience credit without actually having to find a supervisor, because there was a repeated call for a way to earn experience credit without that one-to-one supervisory relationship. So what the Appraiser Qualifications Board proposed was this practical applications of real estate appraisal, or PAREA, which is an alternative way to allow trainees to earn experience credit. In the materials before you, starting at page 176, there is a discussion of essentially what PAREA is and the concept of PAREA and how it will work, including options for computer-based learning, video tutorials, virtual simulations, and virtual reality training, as well as how the PAREA training will be delivered. And that continues on to page 177. This particular discussion draft asks for input from the industry on several questions that the AQB has asked in the discussion draft. And those questions begin on page 178, first being, what is the maximum amount of experience a trainee should be able to attend by completing the PAREA training? Should they be allowed to obtain 100% of their experience by attending Perea, or something less than 100%, perhaps limiting that training option to 50% of the experience required to obtain a license, or 75% of the experience required to obtain that credential. And the second question is, what prerequisites should be required before someone could enroll in this Perea training? Should they require all of the trainee credential education to be completed before someone enrolls? Should those requirements vary based on the credential that individual is seeking? The other two questions are, what level of supervision is appropriate for Perea trainees? The AQB believes that many steps in the training could incorporate automation to ensure a trainee performed the tasks properly. But the AQB wants to know, are there some portions of the training that would require interaction and oversight by a qualified supervisor? And if so, which portions and why? Another question the AQB seeks input on is, what should the minimum qualifications be for those who would supervise these trainees, these Perea trainees? So if some level of supervision is required or is appropriate, what would the qualifications of that supervisor need to be? That is essentially feedback that is being requested by the AQB on each of these questions. And the last question is, should Perea trainees have to complete USPAP compliant appraisal reports as part of this training process? And then, last but not least, should Perea participants be required to provide state appraiser regulatory agencies any additional verification of training beyond a completion certificate? And why or why not? So if they've completed the Perea training, could they simply come to the board and provide that completion certificate, and the board would then give them whatever credit the AQB said was authorized for that training?
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Who's providing this education? Is it third-party educators, or is it coming directly from the subcommittee, or, I mean, not the subcommittee, but...
Well, the actual who is not known at this point. The content of the training would be developed and specified by the AQB. So it's simply an alternative experience model that they are working on developing, and the AQB is asking for input on all of these questions as it moves forward with the development of this training module and concept. So we thought it important to bring this discussion draft before you to invite the opportunity for the board to submit comments, for the board to consult license holders about comments. Obviously, individual license holders can submit individual comments, but collectively as a board, would the board want to weigh in on these questions and provide input? And if so, how would the board like to achieve that? With the understanding that the deadline for submitting these comments is June 1st. So it would be something that, perhaps the board would want to delegate to the executive committee or another committee, if you feel another committee is more appropriate, or whatever the board's pleasure is with respect to whether or not collectively as a board you would like to submit comments.
So what's the pleasure? And who wants to sign up for the committee work?
Sounds like education committee.
You know, I was kind of thinking that, Mr. Peñas, but I'm sure glad that you...
Is that a motion? Because I'll second that.
That wasn't on the record, was it?
I'm just connecting dots. That's all I'm doing.
Just
Sounds like an
connecting
item
dots.
that would be logical in our bailiwick, and I'd take a chance at it, take a try at it on the next agenda as a discussion item.
Well, that's very honorable of you, Mr. Jeffries, and we appreciate you taking that on. Okay, it's 2:15, and since you've gotten direction, let's move that to the Education Committee. I promised you guys a break. We will take, how long do you think you need? 10 minutes? 5 from the far end of the dais, but I think we probably need 10, so let's take 10. It's 2:28, and we are now reassembled after a short break. We are on agenda item number 24. After the gracious volunteer of the Education Committee. Agenda item number 24 is discussion regarding Appraisal Standard Board's adoption of changes to the 2020-2021 edition of the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice.
Madam Chair and board members, I just wanted to report to you that during the break, the Education Committee consulted their calendars, and they would like to and will schedule a meeting for 2 p.m. on Monday afternoon to consider the questions posed by the AQB in the discussion draft for agenda item 23.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then with respect to agenda item 24, we just wanted to bring this before you to update all of the board members with respect to the Appraisal Standards Board's adoption of the 2020-2021 edition of USPAP. The Appraisal Standards Board met on April 5th and adopted all of the changes that were proposed in the fourth exposure draft. And a summary of, or an executive summary of those changes is included in your materials starting at page 192. And these changes will become effective for the year 2020 through 2021. And the new USPAP version will be released later this fall, and you will have the opportunity to begin to take, if you so desire, your USPAP update course to understand what all of these changes mean for appraisers practicing. And so that's really all we wanted to report and share with you about that agenda item.
Okay. Any questions? We'll move to agenda item number 25, discussion and possible action regarding topics for the November workshop. So in your agenda, you have some information that generally outlines for you what the current training program consists of. And I have, with clearance from our commissioner, asked if you actually submitted ideas for our upcoming November workshop by our August meeting. Would that be enough time to prepare and present? And he's assured me that it would. So first, I'd like to open the floor, because it is an item on our agenda. Are there any items that the board would like to be added or considered for that November workshop? And for brainstorming purposes, what we're really asking you is, what do you wish you had been told or taught within your first 6 months that would have helped you, get up to speed more as a board member? If you don't know today, then I've gotten you a time extension grant, and we can just be thinking about that.
One thing that I think near and dear to my heart, enforcement is the process and the complaint intake process all the way through disposition. I think since we deal with that a good bit of the time, I think that would be helpful to folks, particularly new folks coming on, to understand it.
Kind of an outline. And, you know, we've brainstormed in the past. It would be really nice if you just had a bullet point, right? As a board member, this is the realm that you have responsibility for, and this is the realm that someone else has responsibility for. And you have that, but maybe a more detailed briefing or reminder of that sometimes. That's probably helpful even to those that have been here, you know, for 4 or 5 years, kind of a which lane are we supposed to be driving in?
Another thing that's a suggestion of mine is that we, as a board, have a group of responsibilities. Some of those responsibilities are retained and some of those are delegated. I'd like an overview of which ones are which, just so we have a clear understanding of that are either delegated to committees or to specific folks, chair, the commissioner, staff.
Well, they probably move, but maybe we could start with a skeletal structure of that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be extremely in-depth.
Okay. Any other ideas while we're sitting here today? Okay. Let's move to other business and agenda item number 26, request for potential future meeting agenda items. And I've got one that's really kind of so this is kind of the new business section, the way I see it. So I've got a question on something that came up yesterday. I got a telephone call from a licensee who was disturbed about the fact that we had changed language on his license form and added language. Specifically, what he reported to me was that it was a board of directors decision to make the change, and he wanted to know why I had changed his license. Told him I didn't think I'd missed a meeting in 10 years, and I didn't recall having this conversation or voting on an action like this, but it's very possible that I could have missed it because we do approve forms. I've then done vetting and given staff, as you can tell because you've been handed this, a heads up that I was going to ask this question. So the form has changed, and I just asked that we be briefed about that. How did this happen? And maybe just give a history for public input.
Absolutely, Madam Chair and board members. So the certificate of licensure has been is actually developed or evolved over several iterations, and to my knowledge, certainly for the last decade, that's never been brought for quote approval, official approval to the board or to the commission for that matter. It's simply updating the technology, updating the format as technology changed, or certainly like updating the logo and putting the watermark and various things. Over time, we have made it simpler and changed some of the language that's on there. The language that is complained about is obviously the last thing that is on there. For additional information or to file a complaint, please contact the board with a reference to the board's website, where all of that information is. I offer this kind of an explanation. On the real estate side, both brokers and sales agents, as well as inspectors, home inspectors, are required to include and provide to their clients specific disclosures with respect to the ability, the fact that they are regulated and that there is an opportunity to file complaints, and also to make claims against a recovery fund. And so those are their obligations that the agency imposes on the license holders to essentially inform their clients as to what their rights are with respect to the consumer protections that the agency provides, those elements of it. On the board side, we don't have anything like that. There's not a recovery fund. There's no prior disclosure that's required. The only opportunity for the board, other than its website, to communicate directly, potentially, with a client of an appraiser is to include, without the passage of some kind of a rule that would obligate them to educate their clients further, the simple fact that if you provide a copy of your license to your client, then there is this one small inclusion that basically says the agency is here, and there's a lot more information about the license holders, including the right to file complaints. Here, go to the website and find that information. So I just wanted to kind of give you that history and kind of fill in the rationale for it, and leave it to your discretion where you want to go from there.
Can you just tell us when the format changed?
In February of this year.
And when the format changed on our particular license, did it change? In other words, was there a review of all license types, or was it just coincidental that this particular license format got changed on that particular date?
No, it was across the board. We updated the certificates for all the license types and simplified the language on many of them. Actually cut down the amount of language on all of them.
Okay. Well, thank you. It was, for me, the reason I'm taking it up under item number 26 was to try and make a decision about whether it needed to be a future agenda item. And
Madam Chair, may I ask the Commissioner a question?
certainly.
So the board doesn't have to approve changes to the license? Is that right? The board has never asked to, and it has never been a recommendation as a form to bring forward. Yeah. And the reason why I ask is because, every time we change a period on a form, we've got to go through the whole process, and it seems to be kind of the same thing, but...
The application forms, typically it says in the statute, on a form provided or prescribed by the board. And that's the language that kind of drove yes, you got to bring every form, application form and all that to the board for prior approval because of that language in the statute. There's not similar language with respect to the license form itself.
Well, and Madam Chair and board members, you also approved a policy in your meeting in February with respect to forms and what we would be required to bring before you. When we adopt forms changes as a result of rule changes, then we would simply make those changes once the rules are adopted by the board, and those forms would not come before you for review. And then if there is a non-substantive change in a form, like a period or a typographical error, those changes would not be brought before you on a routine basis. If there is a substantive change, however, we would still bring those changes before you.
Okay.
Mostly, I just needed an education, and so that's what I hope you all got one along with me today.
I was just going to say that I don't think there's any reason for us to have that as in a future agenda item. It seems to be pretty perfunctory, really.
Any additional comments? Okay, what about any other comments as they relate to future meeting agenda items?
Madam Chair and board members, as part of the appraisal subcommittee's implementation of registry fees for appraisal management companies, our AMC committee will need to meet over the summer to discuss the implementation of the process to collect those fees, because we will be required to collect them and send them to the ASC in the next year, in 2020. And so we will need to propose rules to you in August with adoption scheduled for, or possible adoption scheduled for November, so that we can then implement that process moving forward starting January 1 of 2020. And that will require the AMC committee to meet. Previously, since that committee has not been fully composed, i.e. we don't have a full contingent of members at that committee, we have met in conjunction with the executive committee. So to the extent that the board wants to continue that process, we can do that, but we will need to begin that discussion process prior to the August board meeting.
For the benefit of the public, do you offhandedly, are you able to speak to the current structure of the AMC subcommittee?
Yes, Madam Chair and board members. Currently, under the statute, that committee is comprised of the vice chair, who serves as the chair of that advisory committee, along with 4 individuals, 2 representatives from appraisal management companies, and 2 members of the public with business acumen that are all appointees of the governor. And we currently have the 2 AMC positions filled, and those are currently held by Ms. Sarah Oates and Mr. David Mentasana. We have not had any members of the public appointed to that committee to fill those roles since the last public member resigned and moved to Colorado, and the previous one resigned because she was moving to Atlanta. And we're currently waiting those appointments from the governor.
So in that regard, I certainly will speak for myself as it relates to the executive committee, and that is I would yield to the chair to certainly, we are happy to assemble as an executive committee to continue to help fill that gap. But is there any concern about the fact that there is 0 public representation, and should we consider maybe one of our current public members to assist in filling the gap instead of it being all industry?
And that certainly is the board's prerogative. It's entirely at the discretion of the board as to how you would like to proceed.
So with that being said, I think the executive committee filled the gap because we felt like we needed to do something, but in light of the fact that, because there were several vacancies at the time the executive committee was filling in, we didn't have 100% of the AMC industry reps in place either. But I'm just curious what you all think the optics of that are. It seems a little weighted to one side, from my perspective, to have 0 public input, and obviously the structure was intended to have some public member input.
I think that's probably the intent, and unless geography is a problem, then I don't mind being a part of that discussion, but I don't know if it's necessary that I'm here or if I can continue to do what I do over the phone.
So in terms of structure and, if you will, filling the gaps for the moment, is count and or intent important? Meaning, should we, are 6 or 7 people, 6 or 7 sets of ears good because we'd already decided that the AMC gap would be filled by the executive committee? Or, so should we step back? Because I do think we need at least a public member, weighing in.
Understand, Madam Chair and board members, that this committee sits as an advisory committee to bring recommendations to the board for your consideration.
So we don't want to get too many of us.
Correct. So you would not want to have multiple board members fill that role. You already have 1 board member who sits as the vice chair. So if you're wanting 2 public members of the board, that certainly would be acceptable. The executive committee could step back and then consider whatever recommendation is brought forth. Or if Well,
You've answered the question, I think. I don't think there's any clear structure requirement other than we can't have a quorum. Okay. I'm certainly willing to stand in or out, but I would like to see a public member on. So as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking that the executive committee generally as a whole should step back. Martha Gale, who is the chair of the AMC, will be there anyway. If we've got a volunteer from a public member and you have 2 AMC appointments, the only problem with that is you've got 4 people. And so if, to the degree that you need an odd number, if there was another public member willing to serve, I think that would be great. If there's not, I'm fine with Mr. Bolton staying over there, or, I'll stand in or whatever. But I do think we need to get some, because it does need to assemble. We need to do something.
I'll be your other public member.
Thank you. I was really trying to not arm twist quite as hard as it was feeling like I was. So I think we should restructure. Wait.
Madam Chair, I've just been reminded that back in November, the board made a motion that Mr. Black would serve as a public member on the AMC Advisory Committee.
We'll see. Wow. So now you two can arm wrestle, Joyce and Tony.
Joyce,
about the second.
I will gladly let you do it.
Okay, so the action.
I couldn't get to the mic fast enough.
Could we just rescind the action in November and replace him?
Of course.
Okay. Does it need an official action?
Do we want to do that?
It was actually made at this same point in the meeting during the future meeting agenda. He volunteered.
Yeah, that's what happens when we get close to getting out and I start arm twisting. Look, standing between you and lunch is somebody's willingness to volunteer. So thank you all, staff, whoever caught that, because that's the last thing. Thank you, Dion. That's the last thing I need to do is, again, overstaff the subcommittee that nobody wants to.
Is this a matter of the appointment office not naming anybody or having anybody to fill these roles?
Well, it's my understanding that they had somebody, and as they got close or near completion on at least one public position, that person then declined the opportunity. And so they were trying to fill, and I haven't received an update in the last time I was over there was about 3 weeks ago. So is anybody? Okay.
So would these board members then have to recuse themselves of any kind of action that we take? This is more just an advisory role?
Not any different than your committee role from that perspective. As long as we don't, get a quorum over there, I think it's fine. So thank you. So now for the record, let's try and restate it so that maybe I can remember what we've agreed, is that Mr. Pena and Ms. Yanuzzi are going to serve as public members on that on a temporary basis until we can get some governor's appointments, or at least public voices. So thank you very much for that volunteer service. What other agenda items should we address? Future agenda items should we address? Okay, let's move to future meeting dates.
Madam Chair, on page 201 of 201, the very last page, you can see that the August the 23rd is the current scheduled date because there was a conflict on the 16th with our general counsel, right, for legal training. So right now, it is Friday the 23rd is the next scheduled meeting date. And then if you look at November, the workshop on the 14th and meeting on the 15th are the next two scheduled dates out there. And then assuming nothing else would change, just looking forward again another quarter to February of 2020, February 21st would be the projected date. So just please put those on your calendars, and if anyone has any significant, conflicts, please let us all be aware of them.
Everybody good?
Yes.
Good.
Seeing no other, is there any other action to be taken up by this board?
I had just one thing I wanted to, like a general, before we adjourn, if I might throw this out there. So I'm not real sure who's in charge of maintenance, and it's going to sound like I'm joking, but I'm not. I don't know who would do this, but could we get that microphone fixed? Because, I mean, I know we said, Tony and myself and Alex sat over there last meeting, and we were fighting. It was broken then, and we were fighting over not fighting over it, but, you know, I'm just kind of throwing that out there. Can somebody get those microphones working correctly over there? And if there are 3 people sitting over there, I mean, I think it would be nice if all 3 people had a microphone, just as a general point of information. So, thank you.
We'll certainly put that request into the Facilities Commission.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any other business to be taken up by this board? Hearing none, it is 10 minutes until 3 o'clock. We'll consider ourselves adjourned.
Thank you all very much.